Hello, everybody. This is John Oakes speaking, and welcome to the Clever Tech Talks, AI tools, tips, and traps. We will be starting in a few minutes, just a few program notes. This whole presentation is being captioned live for those who want to follow along that way, and we're also recording it. So if you're watching this in the future, thank you for joining us. It's a webinar format, which means that you can ask questions, and I absolutely would appreciate if you asked questions and comments as we go through the day, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can. So feel free. There's no bad questions. You just let her rip, and we will try to address as many as we can on the stream or even in the chat. So with that said, we like to always begin our presentations, although all of you are scattered all over the world potentially. Here at San Jose State on our campus, we like to do a land acknowledgement to show a little bit about the history of where this land came from and its purpose. So we have land acknowledgement here. While we gather at San Jose State University, we're gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of the Tamian Ohlone, who were the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and were missionized into the missions Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. The lands on which San Jose State University is established was and continues to be of significant importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that help the Tupantak, a traditional roundhouse which were once located on the historic Lope Yingnos land grant Rancho Posolini y Positas de Las Animas, Little Well of Souls, and also Marcelo Pio and Cristobal's land grant Rancho Ulistac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Muwekma, who have honorably served the overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United States Armed Forces today. And one other comment I'll make is that I had a nice conversation with the members of our on-campus community center for Indigenous peoples, and they love the land acknowledgement, but also just would like to encourage us to take some action to support the local tribe members and the tribes and their causes, in addition to acknowledging the land. So with that said, let's move on. The event code of conduct. We welcome questions for our panelists. This will be a much better conference for everybody if you ask your question, because I guarantee out of the 300 or so people that'll be here, you asking the question is going to be the question somebody else was afraid to ask. So please do it. We know people have strong opinions about AI. I do as well. Some of our panelists, you're going to hear some very strong positions and well-supported positions, but we ask you to use respectful language that's appropriate for civil discourse, and don't let emotions get the better of you. And recognizing that AI can be a controversial and sensitive topic, we plan to ask questions evenly for both sides of the issue. The purpose of our talk today is not to be, yay, AI is wonderful, it's going to solve all our problems, or AI is going to destroy everything and ruin everything. It's really about considering the pros and the cons, the risks, the rewards, and everything in between, and as academic focus as we can, so that we'll all come away better prepared for this future that's coming our way. All right, today's agenda. We are going to be starting off with our dean, Michael Meth, for the brief welcome, followed by a keynote by Kent Bai. Then we're going to have a short workshop. And it's really almost not a workshop, but I'm going to show you some things, talk about images, video, and audio, just as a high point. The hope here is for these workshops for those of you who have not experienced AI at all, is to give you a starting point to explore on your own, to give you some kind of foothold so you can try things out and see if it's for you, or if you're really curious, go deeper, and I'll have some documentation at the end I can share with you. Then we're going to go on to AI and digital ethics panel, which promises to be really interesting, with Roxana Marachi, John Rowski, and Jill Struskowski. Then we're going to talk about large language models in our mini workshop 2, which is large language models like ChatGPT, for those who don't know. And then AI in higher education, which is going to be with James Morgan, Kohar Scott, and Gina Muraria, who are actually using AI in their college curriculum and have experimented over the past year with me And we're going to talk about what works, what doesn't, what their plans are, what their concerns are, and so forth. Then we'll have some closing comments and resources. So it's going to go very fast. It's 3 hours. If you need to take a break, I understand. Please come back. We'll be here, and we'll go until we've answered all the questions that we can manage. All right. So with that said, I would like to welcome to the stage Dean Michael Meth from the San Jose State King Library, and we'll let him welcome you all to the program.
All right. Thanks, John. Welcome, everyone, to KLEVR Tech Talks, AI Tools, Tips, and Traps. I like the title. I just want to point out it's tools, tips, and traps, not tricks. So I really like that little twist. And my name is Michael Meth, and I'm the Dean of the San Jose State University Library, as you already heard. It's my great honor to provide some brief opening remarks and words of welcome for today's AI symposium. When John invited me to provide some introductory remarks, my first instinct was to actually ask ChatGPT to write an opening for me. But as I can see on Ken's face, it was probably just too easy and maybe too tongue-in-cheek. So I refrained, and just so you know, all the thoughts that I'm presenting are actually my own, for what it's worth. AI has the potential to be the most technologically significant development, in my opinion, since the advent of the popular internet in the mid-90s or the iPhone in 2007. Some of us will remember life before the internet. Some of us will remember life before the iPhone. But most of us today cannot imagine life without these transformative technologies in our hands, literally. I certainly can't. So when I think about artificial intelligence, I, like so many folks, can on the one hand see the tremendous potential and good these technologies can do, but also at the same time, I can be incredibly scared about what these AIs may be capable and able to do. John, in the lead up to this conversation and this opening, reminded me just the other day that today what we know as AI is the least capable AI tech will ever be. All the technology is only going to get better from here on. And so that is something that certainly gave me some pause and some food for thought. In my personal experience, I've used AI for text and image generation, just to give some background, sometimes with great success, and sometimes, quite frankly, it's been a complete failure. Quite hilariously so in some cases. However, in the grand scheme of things, I would say that these use cases that I've participated in, where I've tried to play around, have been pretty simple and pretty unsophisticated. And so I'm looking forward to learning about more sophisticated use cases and more context. So regardless, though, of the outcome of my experimentation, what I found is that there's something magical about giving ChatGPT, for example, a prompt and just seeing the words appear on the screen in front of me. And it makes sense in a way most other tools have not made sense before. And then even more magical for me has been when I engage the AI in a conversation to refine the topic or produce a different version altogether or turn some data into a table. And all these tasks, ChatGPT in this case has handled marvelously. Everything has been completed in mere seconds, perfectly formatted, no spelling mistakes, no missing punctuation or grammatical errors, and usually handled with a really high degree of patience and politeness as I provided my instructions for further and further refinement. So these tools today that we access for free for the most part, or free for now anyway, or free being a relative term, depending on how we feel about data sharing, are phenomenal tools. And they are precursors to what I believe will be interactions with technology and services that will become ubiquitous as cell phones and the internet. And this future where this will happen is very, very near. I also believe that every major tech firm is probably working on either their own AI tool or will be incorporating another's solution. And I think we'll learn some more about that today. So I have no doubt that while previously chatbots that we accessed and algorithms that were driving some of these interactions were probably fairly unsophisticated compared to what we are now going to see as we are at the advent of a new era that will bring these tools to a whole new level of sophistication. So each one of us should ask themselves about the use case for this technology. Every organization, whether it's a for or a non-for-profit, should also ask themselves, how can we integrate AI technologies for improved outcomes and do so responsibly and ethically? So where will AI show up in our professional and personal lives? How will our ways of working change? How will these new tools affect productivity, creativity, and interactions even with one another as humans is something that we're all going to be experiencing probably very, very soon. So for myself, as somebody who's always looking for solutions to problems, I have a product idea I want to share with all of you because I can't resist since I have the stage. And I want to say there's maybe this product already exists, or maybe somebody built it, or I can probably ask ChatGPT to code it for me or some other coding tool. What I'm really looking for is, when I think about some of these efficiencies, is the idea of taking some thoughts, dictating a stream of consciousness into the device, and then instructing it to turn it into a blog or an email or a text message or a journal entry. And then I can do that in any language possible. So really the way I can imagine it, it just would be a fantastic tool. So if anybody knows about this, you know where to find me. But in spite of my excitement, and I think John alluded to this already, I'm cautious also in my enthusiasm. AI tech is growing at a rapid speed. Most of us probably did not hear or know about this before November or December of last year. And now we're hosting symposia to figure out how our world will be changed. And we barely understand how the technology works, just given that we haven't had time to really experiment and explore. And yet, we're seeing it already in so many different facets of our lives. In fact, in doing my research, I've also learned that it's not quite clear how exactly the statistical models driving AI produce the outcomes we're seeing, not even by the creators of these products. And so this is, quite frankly, another reason for worry. This insight then raises lots of questions about the ethics and responsible use of the technology. And it brings to mind the Latin phrase, Deus ex machina, God from the machine. How close are we when we don't really understand the technologies anymore? So then, we have to ask ourselves, and certainly I ask myself, what may be a role of regulation of artificial intelligence? As the technology gets adopted, we have to also inquire and problematize and interrogate which communities may benefit and who may also be harmed by it. Which bodies of knowledge is the AI ingesting and learning from? What's being utilized from that body of knowledge? And then which biases may be present in the way information is produced back and processing happens. And then we also need to allow ourselves the spaces to interrogate these issues and to be thoughtful in our own considerations. However, quite frankly, I'm concerned that these conversations may not happen as quickly as the continued development of the technology is being driven forward. So for that reason, I'm especially grateful for opportunities like our symposium, because today we can all learn more. We can more engage in the questions and the topics. And no matter whether you are brand new to the idea of AI and you've only read about it, or you consider yourself an expert, today we're all in this space together. So the schedule is exciting. It features great panels and speakers. We're going to hear from Kent in a minute as our keynote. But before I turn it over, I want to thank John and also Christina Monet for their thought leadership in our library at SJSU. Their idea and interest in AI, and by the way, I should mention this, John's been talking to me about GPT technology for a year and a half almost. So I didn't know anything about it until John mentioned it to me. So he's been at the forefront of reading about this and being aware and knowing. But their interests have turned today's symposium into a reality. And of course, the two of them are supported by so many colleagues in the library and around campus who collaborated to make this event a reality. Too many for me to mention, but I'm sure John at some point will get to all of them and say his thank you. So whether I mentioned your name or not, just know that I, along with others, are thankful. To our speakers and panelists, thank you for joining us, for entering this arena in a rapidly evolving space and being free and open to share your thoughts. And to our audience, thank you for making a time for joining us today. And so just like John said to me before, today's AI is the least capable it will ever be. I hope that we'll all come away inspired with a better understanding and full of ideas on how to augment our lives with AI as these tools become more capable and more powerful, so that we find the benefit and we do it in the right ways. Thank you for giving me the time. Enjoy the symposium, and I look forward to listening.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. And with that, as a good lead in to Kent Bai, who is going to provide us with a keynote. And Kent, I have known Kent for almost 10 years now. He is the host of the Voices of VR podcast. This is where I first became aware of Kent, who really does an excellent job of probing the best minds in the industry about what their thoughts are and the deeper implications of technology on the human condition. He's also quite a good philosopher and a bit of a historian, and really gets to the heart of things. So I was really glad when he agreed to come talk to us about AI. I know that's an area that he's spent a lot of time in, and has some really good interview records under his belt on the topic. But without further ado, I just wanted to say thank you, Kent, for joining us. Welcome, and the stage is yours.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know if it's all coming through. Looks like it is. Okay, so yeah, like John said, my name is Kent Bai, and I've been normally doing the Voices of VR podcast, and I'm going to be sharing some of my preliminary thoughts on artificial intelligence. This is one of the first formal presentations that I've given, so I had to kind of collate a lot of my thoughts, and so it's kind of hot off the presses, as it were. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of present some of how I start to think about artificial intelligence. And so I have posted in the link a link to my slides if you want to take a look at this presentation. There will be lots of notes and footnotes. I also have a lot of extra slides that I don't think I'll be able to cover all the different aspects, but you can take a look at there. And like John said, I've been doing the Voices of VR podcast since 2014. I've recorded over 2,000 interviews, published over 1,200. And interestingly enough, back from 2016 to 2018, I recorded over 122 interviews with AI researchers going to 4 different AI conferences, a couple of international joint conferences of artificial intelligence, the very first O'Reilly AI, as well as more of an artistic gathering of AR artists. And that was for me to try to get a sense of what is happening in the space and to talk to the researchers. And so I guess some of my thoughts around AR are kind of formed by a lot of those discussions that I've had. And like it says here, I've had a lot more publication on VR. It was difficult for me to maintain both of these, but as the latest innovations in AI have been happening, I've been wanting to go back into some of these archival interviews that happened from 2016 to 2018, because I feel like there's a lot of deeper philosophical underpinnings for trying to understand what is artificial intelligence. And I'll try to be sharing some of the ways that I start to think about it throughout the course of this presentation. So I'm going to be covering, first of all, how VR and AR are sort of sibling technologies, a brief history of AI, which is actually kind of the bulk of just trying to set the context of where we've been and where we're at now, a little bit about responsible innovation and AI ethics, and then mapping modes of intelligence and trying to get some conceptual models around trying to understand the nature of artificial intelligence. So I'll start off with VR and AI as sibling technologies, because I'm really coming at it from the first and foremost through this lens of virtual reality. So we have this idea of exponential technologies where there's all these technologies that as they combine together, they're going to start to add on top of each other and have all sorts of new capabilities. Virtual and augmented reality is kind of like this shift from 2D to 3D in spatial computing. We have other things like robots, AI, big data, quantum computing, synthetic biologies that you can kind of see as these technologies that have the capability of making radical shifts into our culture. So to kind of elaborate on this idea of VR and AI sibling technologies, for a long time, virtual reality was bounded by the personal computer with a tether, with a wire. But with the simultaneous location and mapping, the SLAM algorithms, able to have a self-contained VR headset that is able to do this computer vision and kind of keeping track of where you're at. And so you're able to move through 6 degrees of freedom, which was a huge innovation. And for anybody who's used VR, you know, especially without a wire, you can feel the phenomenological impact of what that means. Part of the reason why I shifted away back into VR, away from AI, is because at the time, 2016, 2018, there wasn't as many sort of experiential components of being able to get a direct experience of AI. Now with generative AI and ChatGPT, you have much more of a direct relationship to interfacing with artificial intelligence. A lot of times AI is kind of like happening in the background. It's like this invisible layer, and it's kind of embedded into so many different dimensions of our lives, whether it's social media, algorithmically driving what we're seeing, whether it's on Netflix or YouTube or on Twitter, other social media, TikTok, certainly algorithmically driven, Instagram. So more and more our lives are being dictated by these invisible fields of AI. But now we're at that point of actually having more of a hands-on experiential component of AI. So back in 2017, there was at SIGGRAPH, NVIDIA was showing how they were able to create these virtual worlds in their Omniverse platform, their Project Holodeck, and actually train with deep learning a robot that then they were able to take that same neural network training and put it to a physical robot. So again, saying that a lot of the ways that these are sibling technologies is that you have virtual environments that you're able to train the AI algorithms, and then with the AI algorithms and deep learning kind of weights, actually deploy that out into the world. So you have this kind of back and forth between the two. Also, going back into like the very early days of deep learning, especially deep reinforcement learning, you see a lot of the early research with like video games, especially because there's a very empirical number that you can measure performance and have benchmarking on how well these different deep learning algorithms were able to play different video games. So again, you can think of these video games as these virtual worlds and this kind of sibling nature between these virtual simulations and training of AI, going back way back to throughout the whole history of artificial intelligence. So a brief history of AI, I sat down to do this, and mostly because things have kind of like exploded over the last couple of years. And I wanted to just kind of, because I was tracking it very closely from 2016, 2018. And then there was kind of like different milestones that happened over the last couple of years. And also a lot of debates and polarization around the topic that I wanted to just kind of like telling the history of AI within itself is, I think, going to help set the context for other folks later in the day. So this is at least my first crack of trying to get, it's not going to be a comprehensive, it's going to be a brief history, but at least some of the things that I look to and to how understanding how this has all been developing. So you can go all the way back to 1956 with the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on artificial intelligence. This is when AI was first coined. And so you just think back, this is like before you even have like, computers widespread. You have just the very early research coming together to start to think about this, and you can probably predate it in before this with the Alan Turing papers in the 1950. But I think this is kind of like a marker for the coining of artificial intelligence in 1956 as a nice starting point. And like I said, like a lot of computing was still developing, so you can just imagine the very early days of computing itself. You have folks thinking about thinking machines and artificial intelligence. I think a big turning point in 1996 was when Deep Blue beat Kasparov. That was like a huge, I guess, shift in terms of us realizing that there's some very narrow domains like chess where computers have consistently been better than humans. And there's been a bit of ways in which that these algorithms have been helping people improve their chess. And so the level of chess over time has been increasing. So you kind of see this relationship where AI is kind of an assisted technology in some ways, but also just when it comes to playing chess, the way that these computers think about chess is beyond any human comprehension, and their levels are just so much higher. Then you have NVIDIA. 1999, they came out with the GPUs, and this is, they started with 3D graphics in 93, and then just the fact that you have these innovations in computing and parallel processing of data has been a huge innovation and catalyst for all of what's happening with artificial intelligence. And so just the fact that you could use these, what started through gaming and being able to have better and better graphics on gaming has been, at some point, NVIDIA saw that this opportunity of using these GPUs to be able to train these deep neural networks. And that was actually in 2012 with the AlexaNet neural network. But you can see the rise of computation is increasing from 10 flops to 10 billion petaflops. And you have this kind of like brief timeline of all these sort of mile markers. But the consistent thread here is that over time, we've had this kind of Moore's law increasing of capabilities of compute power, both in CPU and GPU, but especially with GPU when it comes to deep learning and kind of the parallel processing that happens there. And you can kind of see, AlphaGo, AlexaNet, GPT-3, all these are taking huge amounts of data and being able to train these networks around them. So ImageNet is something that was started in 2009, and that's a good marker to say that, a big driver for why artificial intelligence has been able to be so effective is because folks have curated and labeled a lot of this data to be able to have these benchmarks. And so you have this ImageNet to basically go out and use Amazon Turk workers to be able to identify what's actually in these pictures. Anybody who's filled out the CAPTCHAs, they've kind of decentralized that now for folks to prove that you're not a robot. You have to do this kind of like training of AI of these different images as you're labeling different things. But this is, I guess, a theme is that what's a big driver of why there's been so much innovation with artificial intelligence is because there's so much of these data sets that are made available. and you have the deep learning revolution starts in 2012. Again, a lot of these algorithms were created earlier, back in the 80s and 90s, but it was the combination of both the GPU power and the data that you start to have this breakthrough in terms of deep learning that really started in 2012 with this paper, and you've seen sort of just this exponential growth since then with a lot of different sharing of research on the archive, and just really been an amazing last decade plus of innovation in the field of artificial intelligence. So right after, like when I started to go to do interviews was after AlphaGo beat one of the former champions of Go, Lee Sedol. And so again, this was an instance where it was a lot more complicated than say chess, which was a lot more bounded. There's a lot more open-endedness with AlphaGo, and they had to actually combine both sort of a bottom-up machine learning with also sort of a top-down hierarchical Monte Carlo tree search. So in other words, you can think of like the right brain as sort of like understanding the different patterns, and machine learning is much like that, and the left brain is more of the planning and being able to sort of have understanding and knowledge representation. And so they kind of had a blend in this of both a top-down and a bottom-up. And that was one of the key innovations for why AlphaGo was able to have this kind of breakthrough, and then led to AlphaZero and other things that are happening in the context of deep learning. And then large language models start appear from 2018 to 2020. You see BERT and then GPT-2, GPT-3. GPT-3 actually won the Best Paper Award at NIPS, Neural IPS, which is one of the big machine learning conferences. So machine learning is a big driver of these large language models of both the ChatGPT, but also the generative AI. And I'd say, I mean, there's going to be a deep dive into this later, but it's essentially scraping the internet and taking like what is the most probabilistic next word. And so it has to do this kind of autoregressive large language model. So it has to sequentially come up with what is the next probable word, and it can't sort of skip ahead. It has to just kind of go ahead. There's no planning. There's no real deep understanding. It's just taking the context of words and then saying, okay, here's the other words that are associated. And so even though it's still kind of like a brute force way of displaying it, it gives us the illusion that it has a lot more understanding than it actually does. It's a big part of what's the data that's being trained on. Certainly there's a lot of gaps and biased data in terms of it's not complete. There's going to be, it's going to be beholden to whatever data it's being trained on. So if there's a lot of sexism or racism within the data set, then you have a lot of sexism and racism within ChatGPT. And so then you have this other layers of like the reinforcement learning with human feedback that tries to tune and more align some of these systems to more of our values. But there's a lot of complaints that, large language models are not going to ever really there's always going to have these hallucinations. They're never going to be able to be aligned perfectly to all the different human values. And it's exhibiting a lot of amazing capabilities, but there's a lot of deeper problems that there's been a lot of debates around how far can we actually go. On the one hand, there's been a lot of surprise for how far it can go, and they're actually demonstrating a lot of amazing capabilities. But at the same time, there's a lot of other aspects of AI in terms of common sense reasoning and planning and a deep understanding, and it doesn't have any sort of sensory experience from the world. So I'm sure we'll be getting into other presenters will be getting into both what the exalted potentials and also limitations of large language models. But I think that was certainly a big innovation. So this is one paper around, it's a famous paper around, critiquing this, calling these large language models as stochastic parrots. So essentially that it's just probabilistically repeating information, doesn't really have any deep understanding, doesn't have any, people argue whether or not these things are conscious or not. I don't personally think that they are, although I have a different view about consciousness itself. There's a lot of debates around these things, but I just point folks to that there's this active debate between a group of AI ethicists and other folks who are kind of promoting other aspects of large language models of all their amazing capabilities without fully disclosing all their limitations. So this is a good paper to look into, get a little bit more context as to some of those limitations. All right, so that paper of stochastic parrots actually led to Google firing some of their AI ethicists, and so a lot of these big companies were kind of betting a lot of what the future of their company was going to be on these models. And the fact that there were AI ethicists who are raising the alarm of their limitations, and then they get fired, it's not a great look. And it also kind of speaks to how ethics and safety has not really been prioritized within a lot of these systems that have been deployed out, which I'll be getting into a little bit more as the history is unfolding here. But you have DALL-E as a generative AI model that was announced by OpenAI in 2021. And so you start to see some early indications as to this idea of zero-shot text-to-image generation. It's being able to identify what's in they're basically scraping the internet, getting these images. It's taking the captions and associating those two, and its ability to have these higher level features to understand what they call this kind of higher dimensional latent space. It creates this kind of archetypal idea of what these concepts are. And when you put these words together, it sort of blends together all those archetypal potentials and then spits out what for us looks like a kind of a brilliant synthesis of a lot of those different ideas and concepts. And so certainly generative AI has taken a lot of this, what's happening in AI, and actually launched it into consumer facing products that are really kind of blowing people's minds. So if you look at the Gartner's hype cycle from 2021, you can see that the generative AI is right at the peak, and I'd say we're certainly near the peak of the possibilities. But there's certainly, after that comes the trough of disillusionment, the slope of enlightenment, and then plateau of productivity. So the trough of disillusionment is where you see a lot of these different limitations of the generative AI systems as well as large language models. So, but you have basically the consumer launch of Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E in 2022, both in July and August. There was a lot of stuff that was available in private betas. I think it was first, for me in March of last year. Heard a lot of my friends getting and playing around with Midjourney. I was able to get onto it and also experiment it. And it's definitely one of those technologies that blows your mind in terms of opening up new vistas of creativity that you never even thought were possible. So I'm, on the one hand, I listen to the artists and what the artists are doing, but on the other hand, there's a lot of questions around to what degree is the ethics of how this data was collected, were there copyright involved? And then on that level, even with Getty, to what degree did Getty have a right relationship to having image release forms and everything else? And so there's a lot of debates around this. Kirby Ferguson has a whole video YouTube series called Everything is a Remix. And so there's arguments to say, well, everything's a remix. And so this is just another remix. This should be just fair use. But then other aspects of, well, what degree are these actually creating more than just a copy, but it's actually kind of plagiarism in certain ways. And so that line between plagiarism versus fair use, I think, is an active debate. And to what degree are things in the memory, and basically kind of, I think it's a debate that will continue to unfold. But I think the other aspect of the sort of ethical side is just the limitations of some of these. And so if you have the bias in AI, so if you have a lot of the generative AI systems, if you just type in CEO, then you'll get, a lot of the systems would just have 100% of their different output would be a male, oftentimes a white male. And so this blog post, this post goes through and does a test, and pretty much all of them, except for the OpenAI had maybe around 80%. Of the DALL-E had around 80% were men and 20% were women, but all the other ones were mostly 100% male. So again, there's just the idea that these large language models are taking what's out of the internet. It's sort of taking what biases are already there and sort of amplifying them in certain ways. And so, yeah, in some ways that is certainly sort of amplifying harm. And I'll be getting into the utilitarian arguments around that in a little bit here. So it's a documentary called Algorithmic Bias that I highly recommend folks checking out. It goes into how the fact that facial recognition wasn't necessarily originally trained on people of color, and a lot of their faces wouldn't be able to be detected, which meant that if you're starting to use facial detection in the context of policing, then you have a lot of misidentified people that are, the consequence means that they end up having to go to jail, or there's a gap there in terms of the harm that comes from, the utilitarian argument that folks will often say, well, this works 95% of the time. And for 5%, that if you just say, okay, utilitarianism is all about maximizing what is the most utility, but if that 5% is for folks who are already marginalized, you're basically taking something that's already systemic racism, systemic sexism, and you're amplifying that. And so the folks who are already marginalized are having even larger aspects of marginalization. And so instead of taking a utilitarian approach, you really have to take more of a human rights approach and deontological approach when it comes to ethics, and really understanding what the data sets are and what the biases are, because every data set is going to have some degree of bias. And part of the problem with ChatGPT and OpenAI is that they're not even disclosing what the data sets are or what the architectures are. So we actually have no idea what other types of implicit biases may be embedded into some of these large language models. So, this is just a report from the State of AI in 2022, just to say that there's this huge discrepancy between, the different types of researchers in the field, and there's like 30 times less of folks that are working in the context of AI safety. Which is just to say that these types of ethical issues are totally sort of not valued and deprioritized within the industry at large, which is super concerning. And then you have just the kind of pushing forward of launching OpenAI ChatGPT 3.5 as a prototype in November of 2022. And then within like 2 months, it had over 100 million users. It's one of the fastest services ever to go from 1 million to 100 million users within the course of just a couple of months. And so then you have a lot of just discussions. This is from Bankless. We're all going to die. This is the type of rhetoric that we get from some folks within the context of AI safety, saying that the fears around AI is basically going to be so uncontrolled that we're basically in this inevitable path towards death, because that if AI is so much smarter than us, and it's going to lie to us, and it's going to kill us all. So and you get these like really ridiculous editorials in Time magazine from Eliezer Yudkowsky, where he's basically saying we need to regulate GPUs, and if there's people who are not being regulated, then they're using GPUs to train these models. We need to literally start to bomb these data centers. I mean, this is the type of like extreme rhetoric that we've gone from like zero to like all of a sudden, AI is on the cusp of going to destroy us all. Now, I do think there are some safety concerns, but I also think that I'm not necessarily in agreement with a lot of the sort of argumentation that is in this line that we're inevitably going to be walking into our death because of not being able to align artificial general intelligence. So it's been really surreal just to kind of see like this explosion. OpenAI then launching into ChatGPT 4, and then there's literally no details as to what the architecture is. So, ChatGPT, the OpenAI used to be open, now they're completely closed. We have no idea what the architecture is, which means that we can't actually evaluate some of the different claims. So just as an example, if there's if it's able to do coding examples from a certain test, well, we don't know if that model was trained on that data, because you can't test something that on the same sets of data it's been trained on. But if you don't know what it's been trained on, then you can't actually assess what its capabilities are. So it's actually given the AI ethicists a big problem as to actually trying to rein in some of the different hyperbolic claims as to what the actual capabilities are, because we don't know what the testing data is. So we can't actually say for one way or another whether or not these are actual capabilities. Because if it's trained on the data, it may be just coming from memory rather than trying to generalize and prove all these other capabilities. Okay, so OpenAI should be known as closed AI because, again, like they originally thought that they were going to promote all these different open things, but then over time they realized that there's these implications that like the ChatGPT being able to tell people how to create nerve gas. Maybe they didn't realize that there was that degree of safety and security issues. And so when you open source something like that, then you're basically creating these weapons that could facilitate all these dimensions of terrorism. So maybe it's a good thing that they're closed, that's open to debate again. But I think as we go forward, there's lots of different this paper, Sparks of AGI from Microsoft, which was like really going into all these different dimensions of the capabilities of these large language models. There's a lot of critiques around that, saying, first of all, there's a lot of these, definitions of what intelligence is are based upon these kind of more eugenicist definitions of using the bell curve and racist dimensions of how they're defining different dimensions of intelligence. And so there's a lot of AI ethicists who are critiquing a lot of this paper from Microsoft, saying that's just, Microsoft's got this financial interest with OpenAI, so there's a bit of conflict of interest of them doing basically a research paper, but it's also a lot of marketing and a lot of these hyperbolic claims that may not be substantiated. And then there's a whole open letter saying we should just pause all development on all these large language models because of their danger. But then all these other folks these AI ethicists are saying, well, a lot of the people who are writing that are actually implicitly kind of propagating different dimensions of AI hype. And then Timot, Gebru, and Torres have this whole acronym of TESCREAL, which is transhumanism, extropianism, singletarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, long-termism, digging into a lot of the different types of philosophical ideologies that are driving some of these different discourses and trying to break down some of the more toxic elements of that. So that's something to look out for as well. And then, the Center for Humane Technology is saying, okay, the first wave of social media had all these dimensions of AI, and it was saying, okay, we're just going to give everyone a voice, connect with your friends, join like-minded communities. And then at the end of the day, you have all these different dimensions of addiction, disinformation, mental health, censorship, speech. You have doom scrolling, all these different sort of unintended consequences of social media that has a lot of artificial intelligence that on the back end. And so they're saying that this is our first contact with AI. And our second contact is with these large language models. At the surface, it's like making us do faster. It's these creativities. It's all these things that are really positive manifestations. But on the back end, there's maybe job loss and transparency. And they have all these other aspects of safety, security, reality collapse, exponential blackmail. So all the different sort of harms that are coming from this as well. All right, so I'm going to go through some of very quickly, the responsible innovation and AI ethics. So there was a paper that was done by Sally Applin and Catherine Flick, critiquing a lot of the different responsible innovation teams within the context of Meta and Facebook. Basically, their point was true responsible innovation is supposed to have a big red button that says, if there's enough ethical concerns, there should be power in the responsible innovation teams to stop something from being delivered. But a lot of times the deadline for when things are shipping are already set. And so there's a lot of just AI ethic, or a lot of just ethics washing when you have these responsible innovation teams come on because they don't actually have any power to change anything. They're basically just kind of rubber stamping stuff that's already been decided that we're going to shipping things and there's nothing that they can do to stop it. And then after that, then Meta just kind of fired all their responsible innovation teams. And so there's no actual separate responsible innovation teams. It's all up to those engineers who are responsible for delivering things. And so literally responsible innovation as a practice within some of these companies has just been dissolving, reflecting some of those other graphics that I saw earlier. You have this idea, anticipate, reflect, engage, and act. Ideally, you're supposed to sort of have this loop of trying to reflect and engage all these different things. There's a debate as to that you have to ship some of these AI systems and to understand what their capabilities are. But then at the same time, as you ship it, you're basically perhaps doing harm unduly to certain populations. And so should you actually wait and slow things down? So this whole idea of responsible innovation is that this engage part is that you should have like some engagement with the populace and not just have like some sort of tokenism or non-participation, but actually have the citizens and people have some say in that. But at this point, these are all driven by companies where there's no say for anybody from the public to say whether or not these systems are going to be deployed or not. And then, like I said, there's these stage gated of innovation where there should be some degree of deciding whether these should be shipped or not, but none of that is actually being implemented. They're just kind of like rushing and just kind of shipping all these products out there in this rapid iteration. I would point folks to the AI Act. This is from the European Union. I did an interview with Daniel Lufer from Access Now, breaking it down, both the biometric data aspects, but there's a lot of stuff about the AI Act in terms of self-regulation does not work. You have to actually pass regulation. The United States is 10 to 20 years behind, 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 years behind what the EU is doing. And so the AI Act is actually trying to create these tiered systems of unacceptable risk. So there's certain applications of AI in the European Union that are just going to be completely prohibited, especially when it comes to a police use of artificial intelligence. There's some that are going to have high risk, where you have some obligations of disclosure of data and reporting to the European Union, and then some other transparency obligations where you would need to disclose to people that you're using a chatbot, as an example. And some of these actually, with the deployment of GPT-4, may actually be shifting around a little bit. Okay, now to the last section of mapping models of intelligence. I'll try to get through this relatively quickly, just so we can keep moving on with the rest of the program. So there's a lot of different standardized tests that people look at to say, here's the performance of large language models. And I just really appreciated this comment saying, it's amazing how many brilliant scientists will look at a large language model passing a standardized test and think, wow, this computer is really smart, and not that these standardized tests are actually very bad at measuring intelligence, which I think is probably a little bit more accurate, that, standardized tests, just because something is passing it doesn't mean it's necessarily smart. So we have the Turing test, which I think most of the chatbots these days could probably pass the very early Turing test of just indicating that the person on the other side, is it a person or is it an AI? At this point, I think it's going to be very difficult probably to figure that out with some of these large language models and ChatGPT. But there's a AI magazine article, a whole issue that actually goes into the next generation of beyond the Turing test. And I recommend folks check out this from 2016, because it goes into a lot of other ways of looking at how do we make sense of the next Turing test to kind of understand how is AI progressing. And then there's a whole philosophy of deep learning lecture series that happened with all these philosophers talking about deep learning. Highly recommend to do a deep dive into a lot of these different things. And this slide from Jan LeCun, where he says prediction is the essence of intelligence. And so defining intelligence as being able to predict what's going to happen in the future. There's Gartner's multiple intelligence, where you have many different types of intelligences, and not just a mental, but also linguistic. And I'll sort of categorize it into this way: the linguistic, interpersonal, logical, mathematical, interpersonal, musical, spatial, and naturalist, and the bodily, kinesthetic, and then existential intelligences. And this is from my VR work, where you have different dimensions of active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. And this is helpful for me to just kind of understand some of these different dimensions, because you have different, VR is kind of combining all these different media. So the agency aspects of video games, where you're expressing your will, you have the language and the ways that you're communicating with other people within both the social media and books and your phones, podcasting, communication. Then you have the emotional presence, where you have the building and releasing of tension, and film is a medium that's sort of modulating emotions, as well as music. And then you have the dimensions of virtual augmented reality, where you have theater, architecture, these spatial experiences, your sensory design. So when you think about artificial intelligence in this context, it's sort of taking all these things in together, as well as agents that can make choices, take action, have some degree of emotional immersion and sensory experience. And again, you have this sort of progression of all these different communication media over time, where you have each subsequent media is integrating the previous media, and machine learning and artificial intelligence is kind of this next step of these virtual beings and different dimensions of what's next with the future of generative AI, and actually being able to say, I want this type of immersive experience, and have the generative AI actually create that for you. And then the quadrivium is something that I use that helps kind of map some of these things out from math, music, geometry, and astronomy. These were the 4 disciplines that they used. And you can think about it as math is number, abstractly, just number itself. Then geometry is numbers in space, music's numbers in time, and then astronomy's numbers in space and time. So you have these different dimensions of the abstractions and the forms of the objects moving through space, the world body, architecture, unfolding processes. So going back to these different aspects, you have the different sort of mental abstractions of the linguistic, the communicative, the relationships, social dimensions, the logical, mathematical aspects of that air element. You have the earth elements of both the body and the kinesthetic connected to the agency, but also the existential and the freedom, and the spatial and the naturalist, and the interpersonal and the musical. And there's different cognitive architectures, like from Jan LeCun, that's trying to map out all these different dimensions, and not just sort of the bottom up from machine learning, but also the planning and the perception, the acting. And so you have the action, planning, configuration, the critic, the memory, perception, and world models. And Jan LeCun says that emotions are actually kind of the anticipation of outcomes. which is an important part of understanding how intelligence agents are kind of fusing all these things together. So the last thing I'll go through here is just like the International Joint Conference of Artificial Intelligence has all these different disciplines and domains. You hear a lot of buzz from the machine learning side, but there's all these other aspects that are also parts of the community of artificial intelligence. And so you have everything from agent-based to multi-agent systems, as well as most of the stuff that you see is computer vision and machine learning, again, that bottom up. And the stuff that's top down is also things like knowledge representation, reasoning, natural language processing, planning and scheduling, constraint satisfaction, optimization, these multidisciplinary aspects of these topics and applications, humans and AI, search and uncertainty. And then, the AI ethics, trust, fairness, the AI for good and the AI arts, I put under emotional presence, but it can be also seen as other separate things as well. Anyway, these are just some ways that I have to sort of help understand the landscape of AI. And so, yeah, just what I was able to cover today was VR and AI sibling technologies, a brief history of AI, to get a bit more context, some responsible innovation, and a little bit about AI ethics, and then mapping some of the modes of intelligence to help understand different dimensions of what AI is, and how to think about this kind of multimodal way of all these different dimensions of as you study AI, you learn more about what it means to be human is a big thing that I get taken away. And so there's this very interesting way in which that as you study AI and try to map all these things out, you're also mapping out different dimensions of human consciousness and different ways that our body works as well. So with that, again, I'm Kent Bai. I do the Voices of VR podcast. I hope to restart the Voices of AI here soon. And you can scan this QR code or look on my slide share for my slides and more information. So thank you.
Thanks, Kent. That was great. For your first time out of the gate with that one, that's a good talk. I think you're gonna get a lot of mileage out of that. I appreciate it. So we have a few minutes for questions. We're a little bit behind, but I'm gonna do my part really quickly here. But I definitely want to give the audience a chance to fire any questions. We did have one, Kent. Not sure if you can answer it, but I'm gonna throw it at you anyway. Sure. What response has there been about regulation and risk assessment outside of the U.S. and Europe? So I guess that leaves South America, Asia, and Africa.
I haven't. I'd say the European Union is really leading. So I would look to see what's happening with the AI Act. I mean, they're really setting the bar for their trilogue process. They're like 5 to 10 years ahead of everyone else. I haven't, like I said, I track VR mostly, and so some of these different discussions I have because I'm talking about how the AI Act is covering different dimensions of biometric data and how that's being defined, and that has a VR implication. So that's part of the reason why I talked to different folks from the EU, but I'm not aware of any other movements around the world. But I would say that the AI Act is probably the most prescient and the most up to date, especially with their tiered system of saying, here are the different applications that we need to outright ban. Here's the ones that we need to have a lot of oversight from the government. And here's the ones that we have at least some disclosure obligations for people. Like, just imagine someone calls you up on the phone, disclosing that's an AI voice and not a real person. In the EU, you would be obligated to do that. But here in the United States, it's a little bit of like the Wild West, where there's absolutely no regulation or anything. It's like anything goes. And there's currently none of the things that they're recommending to be banned over in the European Union. There's some movements to do, say, like facial recognition and stuff like that, limitations for how the police can use that. But more often than not, we're kind of way behind, and almost embarrassingly so, especially because we're the place that's just pushing this stuff out there without any sort of reflection around what kind of implications it has.
Quarterly earnings. That's what they're chasing. Anyway, yeah, so that's great. Any other questions for Kent at this time? Kent, can you throw your how to follow you one more time?
Oh yeah, I'm on Twitter at Kent Bai, but I'm also at Voices of VR. And at some point, I hope to relaunch the Voices of AI podcast. It's currently offline, but with all this recent developments, I want to get it back in the game and sort of start to publish those archival interviews that I've done.
I think you're ready. That's great. All right. Thank you very much, Ken. I hope you can stick around. Sure. We're gonna go really quick here to hold on. Need more hands. And share my screen. And there we go. All right, so real quick, so panelists at 2 o'clock, start getting ready. I'll be with you in a minute. As I just want to give the audience, I'm assuming, you know, there's 100 of you here and probably another 100 to watch this later. Maybe some of you have not really put your hands into doing anything with VR or generative art or anything. And I just wanted to give like a micro talk on what we're talking about when we're talking about AI generative art and give you a chance to play with it. A lot of what's going on right now in the space is with diffusion models. There's certainly GANs, generative adversarial networks, but when you're talking about DALL-E 2, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, those are diffusion models. And a lot of people don't understand, and frankly, I barely understand how these things are made, but I'll try to do my best to give you a little peek. Because as I alluded to in Ken's talk a little bit, these things that can generate images from text are not directly copying images that exist on the internet. They're actually generating original-ish images. And the reason they're able to do that is they've been trained on that large ImageNet library along with lots of other libraries. And it's really interesting how it works is they'll take an image, and you kind of see in here a picture of a chair, and they'll tell the model, this is a picture of a chair, and it's like, okay, I see the chair, I see the aspects of a chair, and they will slowly add Gaussian noise, just random color to the image until it's completely obscured. And there's different steps, like maybe hundreds of steps in doing this until it can't tell what it is anymore. But the algorithm can still kind of track the quality of being a chair throughout this algorithm. And then what they're able to do is through training and reinforcement and some other tricks, you're actually able to run that algorithm backwards. So you're actually able to start with a completely noise-filled screen, tell it, you know, make me a chair, and out of the chaos, it will start to evolve and refine out of following this algorithm essentially backwards, create you something that's a chair. Now, it won't look exactly like this chair. It would it'd be very, very unlikely, I won't say impossible, very, very unlikely for you to ever get this exact image of a chair out. But that's essentially how it works, is that they're not saving a copy of the image itself, they're saving the aspects of an image that resemble the keyword that it's targeted at. And there's a deep dive here. There's an explainer that goes into much more detail with math and the whole algorithm. If you're a computer or software engineer, highly recommend you follow these links. And these slides will be shared. So don't worry, we will get these to you, and you'll also be on the recording. And, you know, just for fun, if you want to try it out, you don't need a powerful computer or to sign up for anything. There's a free website. They do have a paid option, but you know, it's like anything. There's a free website where you can go called stablediffusionweb.com. Put in a prompt, and I gave you an example of a prompt here: an epic pirate ship cannon battle in a storm. And you know, and I copied this prompt from them just because they had a lot of elements here. And you know, the whole conversation to be had about copying artist styles and all that. But the result is, you know, if you went back 2 years and said, we'll be able to do this, it would be in science fiction. It's just amazing at the kinds of images you can get out of these services like DALL-E 2, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and there's going to be others coming, and there's 100 other options. So I encourage you to go to the website, even while you're here. You know, you can play around with it, create some images. It's instructive to just to see how it all works. And if you want to get deeper, we could probably spend 8 to 10 hours just on image generation. There is a vast community of resources and different types of image generators and plugins and filters and pre-trained models. But just to get you started, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, I recommend visiting and searching for automatic 1111. 1111, 4 ones. And if you just search for that GitHub, you'll find it. That's kind of the market leader. It's freeware. It's not a business, but it's kind of a platform where you can play with all the different options that are out there. And you can even run it on Google Colab. So if you don't have a GPU, you can run it there. And then if you just want to, if you have a powerful computer and you just want to play around locally and have all the models without being online, you can go to Easy Diffusion 2.5. There are a number of options again for that, but this is one I really like. And it'll download the model. You can run it right on your computer and generate art for yourself. So the other thing I wanted to just mention really quick, and I'm going to just keep this short. You can also do voice cloning, music generation, and soon, although you can do it today, but it's not generally available, you can do text to video. And I'm going to turn off the audio. So what you're seeing here is a video that was generated from text prompts. These aren't filmed. They are text prompts overlaid with video. And it's, again, like the theme of the day, this is the worst it will ever be. So very soon you're going to be able to just type in a description of a movie scene and have that video created and presented to you in a reasonably high quality, and certainly at a level of, typical animation, I guess. So it's an exciting time, and it raises a lot of questions, but we'll see where it goes because it's here to stay. And again, the other one I wanted to just highlight, the 11 Labs speech synthesis is very powerful, amazing, and also a little bit problematic because you can clone. Maybe you've seen some of the memes about people having like President Biden and Trump and Obama all playing like a war game together, and it's hilarious, but it's really troubling if you consider what this actually means. So there's some things there we need to talk about. If we had more time, I'm already like behind schedule a bit. I'll just say that one of the things I want to come out of this is that maybe we can all get together on a monthly basis for a working group and go deep dive on each one of these things and get a little bit more experience, because there's just endless possibilities to play with, to learn from, and also be cautious of. So I think it's something we're going to have an ongoing conversation with. Okay, but in order to be respectful to our panelists, I want to move on. Let's see if there's any questions I need to address.
John, I'm answering the second one.
Okay, great. I appreciate the other panelists jumping in and answering those questions, because I want to get started with this discussion. This is going to be a panel discussion about AI and data ethics with Dr. Roxana Marachi, Dr. John Rowski, and Jill Strakowski, who have kindly agreed to bring their opinions today. And I want to especially thank them because, frankly, there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hype in the industry, a lot of optimism and, rah, and look how cool this is. And, and it's very exciting. New stuff is exciting. I love tech. I love playing with new toys. Give me a new toy to play with. And I generally, my first reaction is to see what it can do. And then I start thinking about the complications and the consequences. But these folks, I think, are the kinds of people we need to keep us safe and keep us thinking critically about the advent of these new techs and the man behind the curtain. What's really happening? What are we really doing here? And how could it be used? And so I'm very interested in having this conversation, and I appreciate you all participating. And I think you're all spotlighted. So Roxana, Jill, and John, I think how we're going to do this is I want to hear, first of all, just give you each a chance to kind of make an opening comment about what you'd like to talk about, and then we'll just have a discussion and see where it leads. So Roxana, if you don't mind, you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you agreed to speak with us today.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, John, to participate in this panel. My name is Roxana Marashi. I'm a professor of education here at San Jose State, teaching teacher education and in the doctoral program in educational leadership. My early research was on the evaluation of social emotional learning programs in schools. And as I saw a lot of the programs turn digital and extract very sensitive social, emotional, behavioral data from students, I became very concerned about where these data are going, how they're being used. And as AI has, I don't want to say blossomed, it's not something to blossom, but as it's been burgeoning and like growing so fast, I'm very concerned that we're not paying enough attention to the harmful effects of predictive analytics and AI and all of these kinds of things on children. And so I'm looking at the AI and education space and wanting to ensure that there are more protections on, around data privacy and guardrails, so that this next generation that's coming doesn't get caught up in all the kind of harmful predictions. That's sort of me in a nutshell. And I have a ton of resources and a lot of obviously critical perspectives on this space. I'll pass it over to my fellow panelists.
Okay, I'll just go from my perspective. Jill, go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Sure. My name is Jill Strykowski. I work in the library here at San Jose State. I have almost 15 years now experience working in electronic resources and metadata for libraries. And increasingly that space is about the data sets that are powering discovery. As AI and especially ChatGPT became forefront in the news, it became very clear that when you talk about search, library search is included in that, and that the data sets that we're already having trouble, I don't want to say policing, but not policing, I think is better. We have these huge data sets that library systems and search engines are powering that have been proven to have a lot of bad data in them. From a library perspective, we try to watch this as much as we can. There are professionals within libraries that curate metadata, create metadata, edit metadata, but we only have control over so much. And when it comes to ChatGPT, it's apparent that we have control over almost none of it. So I really come into this conversation as it relates to libraries.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
And John Rowski.
All right, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, well, as my title says, I'm a professor in the linguistics department. So I guess I can comment on the language side of these supposed language models. Unfortunately, for some, they have almost nothing to do with language. So I think what I'm going to present the perspective on today is that, considering almost every single thing you'll hear about these related to language is almost 100% a lie, what can you do to overcome that? They have almost nothing to do with it. That's a pretty liberating fact once you think about it for a little bit. Language is one of the most core aspects of human nature, human culture, and human cognition. And it's refreshing to see people try to develop technology related to processing it. But it's incredibly disappointing to see what has come out of the intense efforts to do so. So, that's a kind of hopeful perspective when you look at what scientifically we know about language and how that translates into the engineering efforts people put towards what is being called language. Okay. So I don't want to take up too much time, so we could just.
Oh, this is your time to take up. So that's great. Okay, great. So I guess, to just start it off, and we can bounce around, and you can ask each other questions as well. But let's start there, I guess, because that was one of the, the essence of when we're talking about large language models, and certainly the topic of AI is very vast. But I think for purpose of today's discussion and what's hot in the news is what's called the large language model. And after this, I'm going to do like a super quick intro to what they are and how they're trained and so forth. But from your perspective, as academics, and you look at this and knowing what you know about it, I guess John, will start with you. Like you say, it's not actually language; they're called large language models. What is that distinction? Like, how do you come to the conclusion that it's not language?
It's very simple. So a language model, I don't want to supersede your explainer in an hour, but a language model, very simply, is what's called a probability distribution over text. So you have text, which is a sequence of stuff, usually word-like things, okay? And you attach numbers to them. And when you make those numbers add up to 1, that represents your likelihood of choosing a particular sequence one word after another. Okay, that's a language model. It's just the likelihood of choosing some particular thing after some other thing. Replace that with a sequence of pixels, as you mentioned with images, and you have a image model. Same idea. Okay. Now, it's not language because humans don't learn text. Text is not a precursor for language. Text exists as a cultural artifact, and we know that text is not necessary for language because there are plenty of communities around the world who have extremely complex languages who don't articulate them through text. They do not have them. Large language models should be called, at the very most, large text models, okay? And maybe probably accurately large sequence models, because really it doesn't matter what the sequences are. It's just sequences of stuff. And furthermore, they're not language because they don't do things in the way that humans would do them, even if you presuppose that humans had access to this kind of stuff that they do. Humans are not given access to the entirety of the labeled internet data and between the ages of 0 and 3. And yet humans reliably learn language so stunningly better than anything that ChatGPT or whatever other things are capable of doing, without the type of concerted effort and billions of dollars and trillions of parameters of things that ChatGPT is using. Okay, so that's just a factual thing. They have nothing to do with language. Okay, so if you expect them to do language stuff, you're going to continually be disappointed. Right?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would, if you don't mind, I would
No, go for it.
further emphasize that, I think language is something they use as a marketing tool. And that's why they call it a language model. It's something, and there was a question in the QA a bit earlier, it was like, what are the monetary implications of AI? And a lot of it is what these companies think they can get out of something that replicates human speech. What they can get out of it is not using people to speak like people. I think, and one of the things that kind of surprised me when ChatGPT blew up, I'm sure there's something in the algorithms that is extremely revolutionary that me not being a computer science person, I'm not aware of. But I was like, I already interface with chatbots all the time. Like in particular, my management company for my apartment building, like responds with a chatbot half the time. And I can tell that it's a chatbot because they're answering questions that are related to the questions I'm asking, but not quite. Because again, the older ones are looking for these patterns, but they have a much smaller algorithm crunching ability, I would guess. John probably can correct me on that.
Yeah.
The algorithm is fairly simple, and you do it all the time. The algorithm is, I look at a bunch of examples, and I have to make a prediction based on something that I haven't seen before, all right? And so I try to see, are there some things that I can look at in the data, and is anything at all useful to predict something else? If it doesn't help you predict something, it's not useful. If it increases your prediction accuracy, it's useful. That's it. We do it all the time, every single day. It's very easy. It has nothing to do with language.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that. A lot of this, I think we need to develop a critical literacy around like differentiating between the hype and the reality. There's a lot of hype that is pitching and marketing these tools, as Jill said, as useful, as this is going to save you time and et cetera. But then it's not naming all the harms, which are like we can get into, and some of which were mentioned earlier in the keynote. But at the back end, if you zoom back, you see this is a massive behavioral data heist. They want to know, how do you ask a prompt? What are you asking about? How do you respond? Are you giving feedback to the AI, right? So there's just like kind of a bigger picture that I want to try to encourage folks to see the bigger picture. Apart from the clear, like we're swimming in this hype right now. you know, John, you mentioned Stable Diffusion and all the artistic AI, and there's all this excitement about that. I'm reading articles about the artists suing these companies because their data were taken without consent. And so like these things have to be part of the conversation. I can put some links in the chat. I've got a whole resource page around the harms. But I think that we just have to be, you know, realistic that we are swimming in so much hype that it's difficult to pull it apart, and we have to start paying attention to that. If not for our generation as adults, again, for the kids. Like, the kids are getting on these tools, and there's all kinds of data traps. You get a kid who is, you know, curious and, you know, a little mischievous and wants to type in, well, what would happen if I did this thing? Now all of a sudden the data goes to the police. Like, ChatGPT is actually saying we partner with, you know, other organizations, we partner with law enforcement, kind of, and you don't know that these traps exist, but it is ultimately, there's just a massive data heist. And the question that was asked, actually, I typed in a response. I'll just go ahead and send it for the but of the who profits, you know, where's the profit in the AI? Just massive data markets. As John said, they're, you know, if they are predictive in some way, they're going to be valuable. And right now, there's a lot of interest in predicting people's futures for health insurance, for car insurance, for all kinds, you know, risk analytics. I say risk with the air quotes, because then we end up labeling people in these harmful ways. So I could keep going.
Oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I want you to. And
thank you.
Feel free, please drop all the links, because I always learn so much from when you. I feel like you're doing my homework sometimes, Roxana, but I appreciate it. But the thing is, yeah, you know, people. I would like to think that many people today understand that things like their Google search history is being collected and potentially used against them, or certainly used to sell things to them. I don't know if people have thought through about that, the prompts they're giving ChatGPT or any of these services that are free, or even the paid ones, aren't doing the same thing in a much more invasive level, because it's a conversation and they can steer you. I mean, there is, by intention, there is bias built into these models.
Right.
Even if their intentions are good, or even if they were altruistic, which is questionable, they're trying to avoid harm, but really they're trying to avoid bad PR. And so what is that, the unintended consequences of those things? So I guess let me rephrase that as a question. So let's talk about harm. And you kind of mentioned the data mining and all that, but what harm do you see could happen to people from maybe, say, an over-reliance on the large language models as we know them today? And anybody
could I start here on this one?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got actually a screen to share. So there's obviously the harms. I mean, there's been documented harms of the folks who are doing the the safety testing, right? Like they're saying that they've been scarred by a lot of like the content that goes into the generative AI systems to try to filter out. There's like documented harms around that. But as far as like the data, where, are the data going to be used for decision making, the automated decision making with AI? This is a set of really troubling harms that we need to pay attention to, of these potential harms around all these different kinds of data decision making that can be made from any kind of the data, whether it's ChatGPT or other kinds. This is a resource page. There's a ton of articles here that I'll share, and I'll put that link in the chat. But just visually, I wanted people to see that it's not just one kind of thing. There's a lot of different levels of harm. Timnit Gebru and colleagues have talked about that AI pause letter, with their critique of the pause letter, that it did not articulate the harms. And they are saying that the letter addresses none of the ongoing harms from these systems, including worker exploitation, massive data theft to create products that profit a handful of entities, the explosion of synthetic media in the world, which both reproduces systems of oppression and endangers our information ecosystem. So there's a lot of misinformation then getting, amplified in these spaces. And then the last one, concentration of power in the hands of a few people, which exacerbates social inequities. There's just kind of a summary. And there are many more specific ones that can be articulated.
Yep.
John and Jill, did you want to add?
Yeah, I'm always going back to the data set. Like I don't know enough about the algorithms themselves to say whether they're good or bad, agnostic. I tend to think that, mathematics that you program into it is always going to have some basic lack of human emotion. But the data sets, which are so opaque and have become such a problem economically and philosophically, and providing people answers in the less sophisticated algorithmic systems that we already use, are going to be, I think, magnified in ChatGPT or in other AI programs, just because of the fact that they present themselves as knowing the answers. So I've been referencing a lot lately this great book by professor at Rutgers. Her name is Sarah Lambden, and she wrote this book called Data Cartels. And it really changed my assessment of the size of the data, the closed data circuit, and how it affects all of us on a day-to-day level. I had really only seen it on a library level, in which way it frustrates me all the time, but it's in all those systems, and I think this exaggerates it.
I'd like to discuss, there's two concepts of bias, which I think is important for everybody listening to this to understand. The first bias is a technical sense, the sense that you can't generalize from any type of data at all unless you have a way to systematically, do so. You have a bias that allows you to interpret the data, okay? That's not harmful. That type of thing is common to everything as humans, right? We only see a certain spectrum of light. That's a bias. It's okay. We deal with it. The other type of bias, which is what people are usually concerned with, is a type of invented type of bias, right? That comes from somewhere that usually defines something to be controlled, okay? So that's the type of, and that has different names, which is why I don't want to put one particular term on it. So it's true that when you see, the AI behaving in some way, it's weird to even say that it behaves because that's anthropomorphizing a bit too much. But that's where the nasty stuff comes in. Okay. So is it possible for me to share something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Big.
You should be able to. If you can't, we'll make it available.
Yeah, no, it's disabled. So somebody could give me a little.
Let's see.
Oh, yeah, here we go. Great.
Okay.
All right. I'm just going to share a little screenshot. Let me. Is this too small?
Nope, I can. It's good.
Yeah. Okay. So here, I hope people watching this can see this. So here's just a prompt. A very naive prompt I did. List some examples of English sentences containing common errors. Okay, and it gives me 10. Here are some examples of English sentences containing common errors. First, right off the bat, I ain't got no time to waste. It even, does a nice thing and tells me why the list comes out here, right? There's a double negative and non-standard word usage. He don't know nothing about it. Me and him went to the store. All right, I could have done it better. I seen it with my own eyes. Interestingly here, as a linguist, when I look at this, I see no errors at all. I see non-standard varieties of English. I see English that tons of people use every single day of their lives, okay? So does the product ChatGPT know something about this? No. Is this problematic? Absolutely, because this is reinforcing a cultural or societal bias that there are non-standard varieties of English that are erroneous, deficient, bad, less than, okay? Whereas when you look at each one, usually they just represent some variety of English that's not the standard English, okay? So Jill and Roxana were definitely right that there is something in the data, probably just memorized, that it's just regurgitating this from, okay? But regardless, if somebody who is not, knowledgeable about this stuff comes and looks, it just perpetuates a very common fallacy about language, okay? So this is just an example. It looks correct. It looks like something that's good, okay? But lots of things look correct. And unless you know what you're talking about beforehand, you have no way to not take the data at face value, okay? So that's a problematic instance of the bias that we're talking about, okay? So that's all I wanted to share. There's many more examples.
John.
Yeah.
That was a great example. Yeah, for sure. Jill, were you trying to say something there?
Oh, it's just that I thought it was
Okay.
well,
Yeah.
It seems to me like in the data set is probably like how to pass the SATs, because I've taught SAT classes where that's one of the first things. They're like, if I use a double negative, people understand me. Why is it wrong? Well, because somebody wrote it down in a book a couple hundred years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So one issue that many people have written about in many ways is that the companies that, in fact, generated this thing, OpenAI, was founded with the idea that it was going to be open. It is no longer open. So there is no way to go in and look and see what the system that you are buying is doing for you. Okay. So that should raise flags for any single person that wants to use this to do anything at all, okay? You are most likely plagiarizing sources directly, and you have no idea where you're plagiarizing them from. You have no idea. So if you're a student watching this and you are trying to use this, you are most likely plagiarizing information without even knowing it, okay? And it's very easy to tell often. If you're somebody who's using it to write course materials, you are likely plagiarizing them, and they may be proprietary, and you are probably stealing them from illegal file uploading sites, which absolutely are included in the web crawl.
I would add, yes, so there's the plagiarism end of like, it's taking and extracting things that exist, but because it's generative, it's also just creating, I want to say stuff, just bullshit. Like it's just creating new things that don't exist. It's not even technically plagiarized, but it's just absolutely false. Like the fact that it makes up citations, you ask, who is so-and-so, like some famous academic. And I actually tested out 15 of my colleagues at San Jose State. Who is Dr. So-and-so? Who is Professor so? And it gave, for all of them, actually false publications. I said, what are their publications? Except for, one administrator, it gave 50% false publications, but still, it was making up citations, it was making up page numbers, making up journals, making up co-authors, giving awards that weren't actually given. Like there was so much misinformation. And one of my worries, especially as this goes into the education space and there's this sort of blind belief that, oh, well, this is going to help us to summarize articles, and this is going to help you write an outline, or this is going to help you, understand some topic or concept. When I have tested it, it has actually been given so much false information that I think we're going to be amplifying a ton of just trash, like actually harmful misinformation. And if we don't know, to your point, John, that if we don't know how that was even created, and we can't trace back to how it was done, like why are we even deploying these systems? It's really, really troubling. And I think the biggest challenge is going to be the psychological untethering of the trust. There's this trust for no reason, that what you're going to get in that output is something to be believed. And if we can try to unpack that and really critically question the output as, made up, we should just say like, this is actually not true. It's hard for people to see. I remember, you want to believe what you've been given, and it does it so quickly. You think it had to have pulled it from a site. It couldn't have made it up, but it's making it up.
There's an anecdote I like to tell my students in natural language processing, which is a course I teach, about exactly what you just raised, that people do like to believe at face value what they see. So in the 20th century, there was this sort of sideshow horse called Clever Hans, like H-A-N-S. And Clever Hans made a lot of money with his trainer, who would take him around and show that the horse could supposedly do all these great things like addition, or like telling how many days from one day of the week to some other day in the future it would be. And people were astounded. They just saw this horse and it would, the trainer would say, what's 2 + 5? And the horse would gesture to 7, and they could go, oh my God, Darwin was so correct. Animals have this innate sense of evolution, blah, blah. And this was fine, and people were astounded at it. And later it turned out that the horse knew nothing about addition or anything, was just trained by the trainer to notice involuntary body cues in order to do something just so it could get a carrot. But the people had no idea. And in fact, it made the trainer very rich. And in fact, you can go on, my students like to show me TikTok videos of people doing this with dogs, where they'll have these dogs go around and push buttons. And supposedly the button push means go outside or something. But that's ridiculous. It has no concept of that push the button means go outside. It just knows that if I push the button, my trainer will take me outside. Same thing here. So it's good to remember that these are systems. They're not just algorithms. They're made by people with intentions.
Yeah, with that in mind, I mean, so what do you? I mean, I've had a spectrum of experiences with these models. I've been playing with GPT-3 for almost 2 years now, maybe year and a half, and getting some really astounding results out of it. It is mind-blowing the first time you run into it, and then you start seeing the warts, and then you get a little better at using it. And then they came out with ChatGPT, and there's people, the reason it has taken off is people get really compelling results. And you've raised some really good points about the veracity, and is it accurate, and is it biased, and those are completely valid. But I think we have to acknowledge the emotional and superficial or at least initial reaction from folks is they really like it. They like it. It's powerful. It lets them do things they can't otherwise do in ways they've never done it before. I mean, Dean Math and I both have had the experience of like kind of throwing thoughts at ChatGPT and say, like, take these thoughts and make them into a nice cohesive email or message, and it does it, and it's like, wow, this would have taken me a long time. So with all the risk and stuff, is there some value, or is all of this just illusionary castle of goodness, and it's just not there? Is it just us fooling ourselves, or is there some value here that we can mine and use without having these negative consequences? Or are the negative consequences just the price we're going to have to pay? Or is it, like, it's a hard question to answer, I think, but let me put it to you this way. They're here, people like them, they're using them. Is there a way forward to use them well, or is it all going to go bad?
I think it's candy, it's entertainment. It's like you said, people like it. When I signed up initially and I was ready to just like critique it, tear it down and everything, I was like, oh, wow, this is really interesting. I got hooked in a little bit at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It did create some things that I was genuinely impressed with. And I didn't like that as a critic of this stuff, like that I liked it so much, right? But there's the draw. It is addictive. It tastes good. It's like, oh my gosh. But it's a con. At the end of it, we're being conned. It's a data heist. It's designed to make us like it and to get hooked on it, and to then take our. I can't. Once you see a con or once you see a scam, it's very difficult to unsee it. And so that's my, you've seen them. If flyers come into your mail and you know what to throw away because you're like, oh, that's a scam. But it feels like the rest of the world right now, or a lot of people are just like, oh, but this is going to be great, right? But then when you see that it's a scam, I can't really trust it, and I think that we're being duped. It's a manipulation of our minds is really what's happening. And I also want to just say another thing. There was our keynote speaker, Kent, had said there was a slide that had like this very extreme, we're all gonna die, that language of like, and I think that extreme, framing the critics in that extreme way is really problematic because it just silences the critique. And I think we have to just say, okay, well, maybe we're not gonna all die from using this, but I think it's fair to say that our children's data will be heisted. Those data will be used for future to try to predict their futures. And if we're not aware that that's at the back end of this system, we're going to be duped. We're
Yeah.
going to end up actually doing more harm to ourselves than good.
Yeah. In Kent's defense, Eliezer Yudkowsky, that is his argument. He is upfront about it. He says, this is going to kill us all, 100%. We're doomed. So he's not misrepresenting his position.
Oh, no, I know. What I was saying is that I think on the surface, to the average person, they're going to see that and kind of just dismiss it as, oh, they're the doomers. I mean, we've been called doomers before, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so it was just sort of the psychological response to that. I didn't mean to,
Yeah, no.
I would take a slightly different view of it, just in the sense of history. I think these are the same things that have been said and were both true and untrue about every technological breakthrough in the past 100 years. When social media came out, there were people who, I mean, look, I've been trying to wean myself off of social media since I started using it. I think ChatGPT, I used it for a few things and I was like, this really speeds up the process. I think the same thing with cars, which we've learned are kind of killing the world, and nuclear weapons and trains and everything before that. And in every sense, every time something new came out, this is what people say. It's going to be the end of this. Some of us are all going to die. Some of us are not all going to die. There will be effects, like 100%. And although we like to think that every period of history, every new technology, people are going to have a completely different reaction to, because they're different systems, I think people still react the way people react. For me, I see this as like a calculator. I was just bringing this example up before, like when I was in second grade and learning my math, your calculation tables. I was like, why do I have to learn this? There's a calculator. I can just use it on the calculator. And my teacher said to me, you need to know how to do it yourself because you can put it in the calculator and that speeds things up, but you might type a number incorrectly. And you need to know if that is incorrect, the answer, and this is how you learn that. I think a lot of that kind of teaching needs to be happening.
John, before you go, could I respond really quickly to the calculator example? I've heard this before, and in the context of ChatGPT as well. And I think there's a distinction that we really have to pay attention to. With a calculator, an effective working calculator, you can actually do calculations that will build a safe bridge. Like if you're an engineer and you're going to use a calculator and you're going to want to build a bridge, you can do that because it's a tool that actually works. It actually gives you accurate responses. But with ChatGPT, I don't think that's an appropriate analogy because it's going to give you a different response each time. It's not reliable. It's giving you false information. If that calculator said 5 + 5 is 10 one day, and then the next day it said 5 + 5 is 83, and the next day it says, something else, that's going to be a problem, and we're not going to be able to build a safe bridge with that kind of false producing tool. And so I think we really have to look at, there are known harms, and something like a toaster that explodes every time that it toasts bread before it goes on the market should not go on the market, right? And so if we know that there are these known harms with these tools, products, if you want to call it a product or a service, we should ensure that they're safe, that they're not going to do these harms before they go on the market, rather than let them loose and then clean up the mess afterwards. So I understand, I'm all for tools in education and improving our practices, but I think we have to really question if this is something that that we can rely on reliably or not, or is it actually giving us false information that could be harmful?
Mm-hmm. Well, they are on the market. They're here to stay, and I've been playing with these models that are not ChatGPT, like the alpaca derivatives. So for the audience, maybe you don't know, there's some public or open sourced or openly available models that have been released, one by Stability AI just yesterday. There's the Llama model, which is raced by Facebook. There's Databricks, Dolly, a few others. And these are data sets that are released and fine-tuned and made so that you can have them on your local machine. I can run large language models on my local machine, so OpenAI has nothing to do with it. And you can even build kind of custom fine-tunings of these to do certain tasks. So I'm wondering, and I kind of feel like that's the direction the industry will go, even even OpenAI has said that the age of the very large scale large language models is over. They've kind of, they think, this is what Sam Altman said, that they think that has reached a point of diminishing returns already. So they're going to go back and rethink their strategy. I don't know what that means, but it could mean, and I think what other people have thought and I've heard said, is that more focused, targeted models like the Bloomberg model, which is coming out, which is all about financial data. And so I wonder what you think about that in terms of the idea that there could be a plethora of different targeted models that are owned or managed by individuals. Probably doesn't solve all the problems, but it does at least solve the big data acquisition problem. And then how do we, yeah, let's just start there because that's a big question. So
I can respond to that.
Yeah, go for it.
I think one has to be very careful about not confusing scientific interests with engineering interests. So like I use Google Translate all the time. It's convenient, it's easy, it's free, it's available, it's on my cell phone, it's fine. As you know, it's totally fine. It's pretty neutral, right? That's an engineering concern, right? Google for a long time was very invested in the idea that you don't really need to employ people who know about language to make a system like that. And it's okay, you know, it's fine. Like that's an engineering decision. Nothing much to say about that, right? Scientifically, I'm pretty happy that all this discussion about how dumb these systems are has in fact led students to become more interested in the algorithms underlying them. That's great. It's led them to want to learn more about human language, which is also great. Right, so that's a plus. No matter how the more ubiquitous the models are, that's great, you know, because that will help people generate an interest in this kind of stuff. I mean, as you said, nobody was talking about this a few, months ago. However, notice the language that we've been using so far, right? I've asked GPT this. GPT told me this. GPT thought about this. It did this. It thinks this. It is this. It is. We're anthropomorphizing this system in a way which is just so like grotesque, which is a reflection of how the funders want you to think about this, right? And it's weird, it's extremely weird to note that in the engineering domain, we have no say about this. Realistically, I mean, I don't know any of the other 90-ish people who are here, but we don't really have any control over this kind of stuff. We just have to look at what the masters of mankind dictate from us. Oh, the era of large language models is now over. Okay, well, great. That's fine. If that's the decision, well, then we're not going to really have much of an impact on it. And I guess for me, the decision is to just ignore that kind of thing, right? If I can't affect it and I can't do anything about it, right, then I'm just going to keep on doing the more interesting things. And I think anybody else who's thought about this should just do the same thing, frankly, right? I mean, in the same way that I don't look at the updates to Microsoft Excel. I'm sure they happen. I'm sure there's like new versions of Microsoft Excel out there, but I don't care about them. I'm sure there are people who deeply care about the updates. I'm so sorry if you are one of these people and you're on the call. But frankly, like, it's not a huge concern for most people, okay? I just think it is really not a big deal. It's when your agency is taken out of it to like feel the need to bow down to some tech master just because they've told you this is revolutionary. I just like reject that.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, we're coming up. There's several questions in the queue I would like to give audience to. So let's do that, and then maybe just you could be thinking about your closing comment. But real quick, so anonymous attendee asks, is there any public information about how much human labor goes into training a model like GPT-3 or 4? Let's talk about the RLHF, which is reinforcement learning by human feedback, I believe, is kind of what they're going for. So anybody have any data on that?
I do. In fact,
Okay.
I can do even better. There's a Time magazine expose, which was incredibly damning of OpenAI because they have outsourced the labor of actually fine-tuning the data to a firm, I believe in Kenya, for which they were paying the workers far under the minimum wage for Kenya. No benefits, no training, no mental health support for looking at all these grotesque images and such. tons and tons of human labor, human design, human everything going in. I'll find that link and drop it in the chat, but it's more than you look, and the more you look, the grosser it gets.
I saw that article. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have a quote about that. OpenAI paid outsourcing partner Sama $200,000 to teach ChatGPT how not to be violent, racist, or sexist. Sama's workers were compensated between $1.50 and $2 an hour to keep ChatGPT from mimicking the worst kinds of human behavior. Kenya-based workers interviewed by Time reported being, quote, mentally scarred by performing the job.
I saw that article too, and actually my first thought is like, why do we have this huge data set and you're paying a bunch of people how to teach it to not do something, to take it all out? Facebook had this problem too, of like paying a bunch of people to turn off the ugly things. Like, why can't we start with a good data set instead of starting with the data set we know is intrinsically flawed and then trying to go back in and take out the bad stuff?
I think it might be that they're filtering people's questions as well. So it's not like the data set that yes, the data set it's drawing from is going to have some problems in it, right? But I think that they're looking at the responses coming in and filtering those out, and that's like the questions that they're getting. That's my understanding of what their role in that kind of filtering.
Yeah, it could be.
But
it
it's
could
a
be
good
little bit of
question.
both.
There are two steps. You do what's called pre-training, which is when you look at the large unfiltered text corpus. And then there is, well, various names for fine-tuning the model, which is when you go back in and depending on the goals, you adjust bits. Yeah, two steps.
Yep. All right. Thank you for that. That link, that's good. And I think that answers the question. Leslie Pound asked, so this is astounding as someone who works in generative AI. This is missing the mark. Is GPT-3, I guess, has already changed business, coding, and education. And you know, there's a lot of economic activity and content creation happening. So that's definitely a true statement. It has absolutely changed business, coding, and education in some sections. I think what the panel is saying is we need to be very, very careful and consider what we're doing.
We're not saying it hasn't changed it. I think we have to question, is it changing it for better or for worse?
Yeah,
we're suggesting. I mean,
and I wonder, do you think like we're in a hype cycle that's going to settle out and people are going to get bored with GPT and kind of go back to other things? Hopefully, okay.
Unfortunately, I think it's slightly more boring. I don't think it's changed anything, but I think people are being convinced that it has changed something, and we're just going to keep talking about that until we've convinced ourselves that it's changed something. That happens all the time in the world of business. It happens. It's not a good or bad. It just happens. Like you just tell yourself it's revolutionary enough, and maybe it comes to like get enough money to be that way. I don't know.
You're saying human beings are subject to reinforcement learning with human feedback?
Well, this is so scientifically, this is kind of interesting because it represents the largest scale experiment on one of the oldest and constantly debunked ideas in psychology, which is this idea of naive reinforcement learning, which keeps rearing its head, but has been debunked over and over again since 1950s, when even the students of the people who proposed it didn't find that they worked even on simple model organisms like, you know, rabbits and pigeons and whatnot.
And what is that?
Now we have data, and it still doesn't do what you want because you still need to go in and convince everybody that it's actually doing what you said it should do. So it changes nothing.
What's a 10-second definition of a naive reinforcement learning?
Same idea here, right? You don't know what the system's doing. It's a black box. You're just allowed to control stimuli and responses, and you're allowed to tune the response curves in a way that like fits some particular experiment, right? So put a pigeon in a box, give it some stimuli, see what it does, etc. Right? Okay. You control the schedules of reinforcement and supposedly see what you've trained the animal to do or whatever.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay, another question.
Old idea in psych. Old.
I think with calculator, identity is not stored and operations are not stored, but with these new technologies, data is stored and dispersed globally, and therefore can be exploited without regulations being in place. And currently, there is next to no regulations about data retrieval and use.
Yeah, I would jump in and clarify. I don't know how other people have made the analogy, but for me, the algorithm that the data scientists created, like that to me is the calculator. The training set is not part of the calculator. And that's where I find my objections lie, is in what they're training it on. And that's the stuff that's stored. But again, I'm not a computer scientist, so there could be bias programmed into it that I'm not aware of.
And my critique is on, like, yes, there's the trained data and the, like, what it's pulling from. I'm looking at the user end and the user data. So I agree with the person's concern about the fact that the user's input is also going to be tracked to the question that they asked, and it is tracked. It's a two-way data. So I think that's an important critique, that in addition to incorrect data that might be coming from the GPT, but it's also taking who's asking that question. As it relates to another kind of marketing tools, they say, oh, this is going to help English language learners to learn English, right? Like, well, is it going to eventually then tag someone who's asking questions about proper English as this is not a fluent language, English language learner, and you should filter them out of your job search, right? Like, that's a potential hidden harm that oftentimes doesn't get talked about in the like kind of marketing hype of like, this is going to be a tool to help you, well, it might initially be of like this surface level help, but then is there a back end that we're not paying attention to? So.
For sure. All right. Well, so one more question, and I would invite the panelists to look at the question queue and type in any other answers they want. But I want to keep going. But one last question that got some attention. There must be some benefits that I think that AIs to education. For ChatGPT, it is important to provide proper guidance for students to use ChatGPT rather than kill it right away. So here's somebody who's concerned but has hope. In the real world, there's no correct answer to many questions. I think it's important for educators to guide students to use their critical thinking and analytical skills, double yes, to synthesize and review the info rather than straight copy some of the so-called answers that ChatGPT generated. I think I agree with that.
I'm all for critical thinking. I don't think it's a good idea to require students to use it, because again, they're giving their data away. You can print out answers. You can critically analyze anything on the web. I don't think you need AI to do critical thinking. So I just have seen way more harms of the AI in education than the benefits. But
all right, well. So I think all the AI hype people bailed on the conference a little bit ago, but I appreciate, the thing is I am pro tech, but I also I guess I'm ambivalent, because I see some benefits and utility, but obviously there's huge problems that we need to address. We could have this.
Just reiterate my statement that I've been quite surprised to see how interested this weird piece of product has made students interested in issues of language, because they use it and they see how annoying it is, and it makes them want to look at language. Or they see an algorithm and they say, oh, what does that mean? What is an algorithm? Why do I want to take a class in algorithm? Amazing. So that's kind of cool. So the product, if you try to just teach to the product, that's a waste of everybody's time. But if you use a product in a way that you would use any other product, right? Nobody teaches to the whiteboard, but if you use the whiteboard to teach something unrelated, right? That's when you do something nice, right? So think about what it's doing and then design stuff around that, not like just teach them how to use ChatGPT. I mean,
absolutely. I will say that I think the advent of this technology, whether it's ChatGPT or another model or the language models, is introducing value to the students who chose to study philosophy and ethics and English and linguistics and history at a level that maybe brings some parity to the engineering department, because you need to be able to think critically, articulate your ideas well, and know how to defend an argument to have any chance of using these tools effectively. And I think that's going to be a valuable skill for both content creation and defending yourself against people who are using it to pull the wool over your eyes. So we've come right up to 3 o'clock, so I don't want to keep, I know many of you have to leave or have to go, but any last comments, like very brief last comments before we move on? And I want to thank the panel for their thoughtful contributions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's no fun being on the dark side of a hype technology. I get it, but I appreciate you taking that because it's necessary.
Thanks. I guess as a closing comment, I'd like to just draw attention to some of the emerging technologies and putting guardrails around like the convergence of multiple forms of data. So there's genomic data coming out. There's all these attempts to try to put, do this predictive analytics from like career, cradle to career. There's a cradle to career data systems building and stuff like that. So I think there's larger conversations to be had around critical lens on AI and education. So I would just encourage also for folks who have that critical lens to dig into some of those areas. There's a lot of work to be done. Thank you for inviting the panel.
All right. Any other comments? Okay, then.
Yeah, I'm
go ahead,
gonna plug 2 SJSU initiatives. So
excellent.
There's a new bachelor's degree in computer science and linguistics. If your students are into this stuff, tell them to go take classes in it. There's going to be a new master's program soon. Same idea. Right, so at all levels, you can come hang out here and learn about it.
I might call you up about that one. Great.
I'll
Thank
plug
you so
the
much.
library.
Yeah, please do, Jill.
We have a fantastic reference staff here, so if you ever ask ChatGPT something and you don't know if it's right, you can go ahead and ask a reference librarian or your professor.
And as part of the KLEVR Lab, just so you all know, is in the library. It's hosted by the library, and it's my job to try to bring VR and AI and Internet of Things and all this emerging tech to the student and faculty for research and educational purposes. So if you have questions, you can always reach out to me. Come to the lab and we'll play with the models, and you can use my account so you don't have to give away any of your own data. So, all right. Thank you again. I'm going to move on so we can keep a little bit on schedule, and I will just share let's see, go back to the slideshow real quick. And okay, so we are going to do a super quick discussion on large language models. And if panelists want to attack me on this, because if I'm wrong, because I might be, please do. But this is my understanding and the best I could come up with. And I used various sources. I used ChatGPT and other sources to verify what ChatGPT was telling me to come up with this. So let's begin. So real quick, how LLMs work. I'm not going to, these are complex papers, but I really liked the Stephen Wolfram article, What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work? Very good discussion, and he steps through it. And I did another talk a while ago for our library staff about how it works. And this is an inaccurate, but kind of conceptually, hopefully close enough view so you understand what's happening. We've talked about tokenizers and so forth. But if you ask ChatGPT, for example, how does ChatGPT work? There's a thing called a tokenizer, which will then take your words and look for the structure of the sentence and what you're doing, and try to like figure out what words are important in that phrase, and then uses that to align itself through this massive statistical database. You could think of it like a word cloud, although word cloud's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. But there's these weights and biases. You might hear that phrase talking about between the parameters, which are the different tokens and the different elements of this giant database, that when you give it a prompt, when you say, how does ChatGPT work? It will say, like, when I see ChatGPT and work together, it's not usually about work and digging a ditch. So it will align itself slightly different, and that'll tweak the weights and biases just enough to kind of give you the direction of what you want to go. And then what you get is this chain of text. It never knew what we were talking about. It never had a thought in its head, but it gives you this chain of text that has a statistical likelihood of being accurate, assuming that the data you gave it was accurate and that it was reinforced accurately and is appropriate. So this will not get you even a C grade in a computer science paper, but just to give you an idea that you get the prompt that gets tokenized, and then that aligns it through this giant database of information, and you'll get this chain of text magically appearing on your screen. If you want to get deeper into it, there is some good links here. Andrej Karpathy is a former OpenAI technologist and developer, and he has a YouTube video how to make a GPT model. So if you're a software engineer out there or somebody who just wants to get into this and go through it, he'll walk you through step by step how this technology works and how you can actually build one yourself. And the New York Times, just in the last week or so, I think it's this week even, or maybe last week, did this series on LLMs, which is a lot more accessible, but you'll have it's a good read, and I highly recommend it. And if you don't have a New York Times subscription, you can get one through the library. Yeah, so that's that. The big graphic here is an illustration of the transformer model, and because of time constraints and the complexity of it, I think I'll just leave that for you to investigate, or we'll talk about it at another time. Let's see. So we, I want to point out that I mentioned this already, that the ChatGPT is not the only game in town. It's definitely the 800-pound gorilla in the conversation. They've made huge PR wins, and people are talking about it. But there are new projects coming out every day. And we'll talk about those a little bit after the next panel. But you can run them on a Google Colab or on your own computers, so you can play around with the idea without having to pay any money or give any of your data away. And that's something we can talk about in a future conversation. But to try to maintain some semblance of being on time, I want to continue on and say that we are now going to have a discussion on AI in higher education with some other panelists. I think this is going to be, we kind of had the cautionary tale version of this. Whoa, there we go. And now we're going to have some participants who are had some good experiences and raised some questions about how to use these tools in higher ed and what they plan to do in the future. And that is James Morgan and Kohar Scott and Gina. Is Gina here? She was here. All right. Well, hopefully Gina will come back. Hello, Kohar and James.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. So let's see if we got anything in the chat we need to address, but appreciate you joining us today. So by way of introduction, I've had the opportunity to work with Kohar and James and Gina over the last several years, bringing their classes to the KLEVR Lab for various things, usually about VR. But this last year, we were all curious, because these are the people who like to push the envelope a bit, and said, let's use some AI tools in our classes and have classes come experiment with AI. And so I'm going to let them talk a little bit about what they did. Hopefully Gina can show up, or I'll talk about what she did with me. And what I would like to do for this conversation is, tell the story. How did it go? How did we come about this? And then, was it successful? What were the problems? Is this something you're going to do more of in the future or less? Or what would you do differently? Really as a way for any of the faculty or people out there who might be considering using this in an educational environment, what they might do to have a good experience bringing AI into a classroom. So that's the objective. So let's just start, and I will go along with my viewpoint and say, Kohar, introduce yourself, and then we'll have James introduce himself, and then we'll talk about what we did in class.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about my location. I'm traveling, so I'm really excited to be here, and thanks for asking me to join.
And I appreciate you joining us, because I knew you were traveling, and I appreciate you making the time in your trip. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor in the industrial design program in the Humanities and Arts College. I'm teaching classes from freshman to senior level, and I've started to introduce AI as a tool for inspiration in the first and second year classes. Is that do you want me to go into any more depth?
That's good. Just no, we'll loop back and dive into industrial design in a minute. James, go ahead.
Hi, I'm James Morgan. I am a lecturer in the Department of Art and Art History, and I also teach a class that's cross-listed with the Computer Science department. Last semester, I taught a course on AI tools for artists, and I'm looking to take that into the future. But the learning that I did from that in fall is directly impacting like my introduction to digital media arts class. I'm going to talk a little bit about like one of the projects that we did, and then I'm going to also like sort of allude to like where it's coming in a little bit later in the semester.
Great, thank you. So let's just start off, because I think James, I'll go with you first, because you were the first one that I worked with on AI for your class, and we've been talking about this for a few years, or last year I think we started. And especially as an artist, I think it's really, as an art teacher, an art professor who are teaching artists and engaged in the community and involved, there's we heard a lot of concern about using these generative AI tools for art. And, I'd be interested in your perspective and how you brought it into your class and what the reaction was to you bringing this into the college curriculum and what your students thought of it.
Well, I really started using the generative AI over the summer in preparation for the class that I taught in the fall. And in that time period, I made a book. Oh, I don't know if you can see this very well, but this exemplifies my experience with artificial intelligence, and that this is a book of dark magic. And all of this was generated through disco diffusion, which is a precursor to stable diffusion.
Yep.
I wanted it to be something that I could hold in my hands. I wanted to get a feel for it. And my immediate takeaway from starting to use this was, boy, this makes a lot of stuff. And so I started looking for things that I thought that I could use this. The screen is not being very friendly to me. That's okay. I took that into the course that I taught in the fall, and it was all really about us trying to keep up with the advancements as they were like sort of dropping. And then towards the end of the semester, ChatGPT started to become a thing. So we didn't have a chance to integrate very much of that. But spinning around and working with my Introduction to Digital Media Arts class this semester, there's a project that we do that is not very much fun, but that has like these learning objectives that are just really important for the students. And that is that I have them write a paper, a 1,500-word paper on what new media art is and what digital media art is. And this is really about like sort of getting an understanding of what's going on. So I give a couple of lectures about this, but the paper is really about going out and finding artists and connecting them to the students' own work, and then putting it all together with the definition that we use for this and presenting it. And in the process of doing this, I mean, I've got like some tips and tricks that I use for this. Is like I have them peer review each other's papers, because then they're not just picking up 3 artists, but they're picking up like 9 artists and getting an experience for the artists that other people like found compelling. But this project it's horrible. It's like, I'm not an English teacher. I don't ever really want to teach English. They're heroes for going through all of this, honestly. Typically the writing is pretty mediocre, but trying to goose that into a place where it's readable and informative is a challenge. So I started using ChatGPT with this in particular. And the first thing that we did, and I don't know, can I share my screen here?
I believe we can promote you if you can. See if you can.
I just want to show you just what it's looking like. I don't think I want to go through it in any real sort of sense. Can you see this?
I think you can. Yes. There you go.
Okay, so I start out with doing demos, and it was really important to me to actually show this live in front of the class, because it shows its faults as well. It shows the things that it gets like sort of hung up on. The thing I like about ChatGPT now is it is it's reasonably transparent about what version you're working with, right? Some of the earlier versions were were somewhat problematic. But like to say, like, list 5 new media artists, if you don't know what new media is, you don't know how to filter this, right? So, and being a person who's in the field, I can look at this and go like, oh yeah, I recognize these names. I know these people. I know that they're in the field. So I can do a quick little check on that. But I'm like, I noticed early on that it was like, it favors the men in the field. I think that Camille Utterbach, it's really great to see her on this list. She wasn't on the list earlier. I think it's kind of like taking the hint. So like, so asking it, saying like, pointing out to students, well, like, hey, let's look for some new media artists that are women, right? And put them onto this list too. And so then it comes up with this list, and it's like, you know, I don't know that I recognize everybody on this list in like a sort of a deep fashion, but I know a lot of these people, and I know that they're really deeply rooted in the media, right? Okay, we can go a little bit further, right? So what about 5 new media artists that are identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color? Right. When I first posted or poked this in there, it didn't understand the BIPOC thing, so I just figured I'd spell it out for it, and then it comes back with it. And again, it comes up with artists that that sort of identify in these ways. And I haven't done direct like research on these sort of things to make sure that they're actually identifying this way. But I do recognize the artist name, and I do know that they sort of like end up falling into this. So then I'm like, list 5 queer artists. And I was worried when I typed this in there that it was going to go, oh, queer, bad word. Because when you start to filter things, this is a word that gets filtered, right? And it came up with, again, 5 artists. And then I'm like, okay, like list 5 media artists, new media artists from Ohio, right? And what this turns into is I challenge the students to find artists that are their doppelgangers, that sort of represent their lived experience, at least as far as they're willing to express it, with no requirement that they say, you know, I'm a this or I'm a that, but to be able to find artists that are out in the space that are much closer to their identity. The students really like this. They really liked being able to find these things, and at the point in time, I still think it's the case that it's like, it does not give you portfolios. It won't give you links. So having these names, the students then had to go on to the network to do additional research. I forget which librarian said something about this, but it's like, it's something about like being able to check some of these things. And I'm like, my head exploded there. I was like, oh, that is such a good connection. So I know how I'm gonna connect this the next time that I teach this, right? But just in finding these artists and finding this sort of deeper connection to the medium that they're working in, the choosing these handful of artists just became like almost joyful. Right. On top of that, I was able to demonstrate, like, for some reason, when I was asking questions, it got into this sort of like loop where it was like, it was only giving me artists with the name Zach. And that was so strange. But thankfully, it happened in front of a class. So I'm like, well, look at that, you know. This is illustrating like one of the challenges here, right? And it's not that it hallucinates. It's not that I want to put any kind of like behavior into it, but the information that you get out of it that's the starting point. You have to go and you have to develop this into something that's going to work in the paper, right? I also took specific pains, and it was like talking with the librarians, like how do you cite the use of ChatGPT, because I want my students to use it, but I don't want them to be like worried about plagiarism. So what is the proper way to do that? And we kind of came up with the thing that we decided we're going to use in class, which is to say that they list the version of ChatGPT and the prompt. And when I saw those in the references for the paper, it gave me a much deeper understanding of what the students were asking as well. I got yet another connection to the students that were writing these papers. And oftentimes it would be, okay, give me or tell me more information about Golan Levin and his practice, right? But other times it was even more specific, and it just like, it ended up having more detail into the thinking, yeah.
So the prompt itself gave you insight to the understanding and the mindset of what the student was doing. That's pretty interesting. I like that.
So, I mean, and that's, like I said, that's the one project that we used it. I think we used it really well. I also worked with them on like, okay, getting ChatGPT to help them refine their language a little bit, so that they could have it do like a little bit of a rewrite with better grammar, with proper spelling, that sort of thing. The things that make it a little bit easier in the process of doing this, easier to read. I realized I don't like the tone that it writes with, so I always usually throw in a little bit of Vonnegut or something like that just to spice it up a little bit. So in that particular project, I think it turned a project that was just really difficult to deal with and made it a lot lighter, easier for me, made it easier for the students. I should say there's one more thing in that writing project that I think is important, which is that the students have to connect their progress or their direction with the artist. So they have to say like, this artist works in murals and I want to do that too. That sort of thing. There's like two reasons for that. The first reason is that it's easier for students to write about their own work and things that they want to do. And the second thing is it's harder for an AI to write about that. And that second part is just like kind of a side benefit. We're doing a module on coding right now, and I'm getting ready to do a demo that will involve like generating code with ChatGPT. Right now, we've just been using it to check code. And I tell you, when you forget to put like one little semicolon somewhere in there, sometimes it's hard to see that. But you take and you put your code through ChatGPT, it will identify it and it will explain what other issues you're sort of like dealing with there. And it's like just amazing from that standpoint.
The coding buddy is a great application for me as well, because I spent years in computer science. I even coded professionally years ago, and I know how code works. And I think and so I use it for that. But I think there's a distinct advantage, and kind of what you alluded to as well, and especially with regard to code, is it's most valuable when you kind of already know what you're talking about. Like, for example, if you turned me loose and said 5 new media artists, they could all be named Zach, and I'd be fine with that, because I don't know those people, right? I could be easily fooled. And if you didn't know coding, you might get some really bad code going and not understand why it's wrong. So I think there's some context in there that you bring up, which is a good point. And I do agree with you. I think, it doesn't give you the final answer, but it gives you a head start maybe, or a different idea, or,
It's a beginning point for research for this, because it won't give you portfolios, and it won't show you examples, and it won't show you what it is about them that you like.
Right.
So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so that's a good starting because I know what I did with Kohar, and this is exactly like the ideation part is key to what her experience was. So Kohar, let me give you the floor for a second, and you can kind of compare and contrast maybe a little bit about what you did versus what James did.
Right, and I totally agree. I think that when it comes down to it, you still have to have a beginning starting place of some knowledge, and that's where my position with AI and bringing it into the classroom, I'm super excited, because I think it is for us an avenue of reintroducing critical thought. It's not removing, because you still need to have some understanding of what you're looking for. And I think that collaborative aspect is what's really super valuable for us as educators and for the students in using the tool. Earlier, I was listening to the discussion and the idea of the calculator and the discussions around the example, the metaphor of AI and the ability to content generate and generate images is kind of like in a sense that way. When students are looking for information and when they're using the tool, I'm really excited about it being a collaborative effort. And so if I can share my screen, I can share some examples from my class. I don't know if
Sure, yeah.
Let me see. Okay, so forgive me if it's a little bit clunky. I'm going to try and do this on my iPad and see if I can do this. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so traditionally in our design, industrial design process, we won't start as a, we don't design in a vacuum. So we might have some inspiration images in the very beginning. And these examples that you see, if you can see, the traditional inspiration board is something that might be put together by a student. If in this project in specific, it was for a speed form project. And so the student would pull together images that represent or reflect speed. And so we would typically, and then you put together some words. So in this exercise, we would typically get a lot of fish, airplanes, birds, a lot of that kind of imagery. And then the output would also have that kind of reflection as well. So we I took this exercise as a great place to input or to explore AI generated images instead. And so we got really wild, wacky images that didn't necessarily make sense. It's just the AI mashing things together. But again, the point is for in design, in this exploration, in this example, and in certain cases in design, you might have a targeted inspiration, but if you're just looking for inspiration for form generation, it doesn't really matter where it's coming from. And so what the AI is doing is not necessarily something that's it's still useful, even though it might not make sense. So in this case, you can see like they're kind of automotive looking, but they're still kind of mashed up images, and the same thing here. So to speak to the other point that you're making about like referencing somebody specifically, like if you were looking at a digital media artist and you don't really know, well, for example, if you were looking at Speedform, Luigi Colani being one of the recognizable automotive designers, when we typed in DALL-E, Luigi Colani inspired Speedforms, we got something that did actually look somewhat reflective of his work. But again, you'd still have to have a little bit of reference to understand what you're looking at. So this was incredibly useful as part of our exercise. And that's really the point that I'm trying to make, is that for us as a collaborative exercise, the students really loved it. It was useful, even though the imagery was, maybe bizarre and nonsensical. But in this example, these forms were later used. So I asked students to trace over them to find some lines that would be inspiring for something that would evoke speed. So, and that's really where it's useful, is as a collaborative tool. So, going further, these are some examples of how you could take the Luigi Colani inspired speed forms and then applying it. And these are just, it's not exactly the process, these are examples. So it's not the process that was used. I pulled these images from Behance, but just to kind of juxtapose how a designer might use the inspiration, it would be to eventually generate some forms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and when we did a lab, we did one where you gave them a prompt for a vacuum stainless steel water bottle. And so everyone was generating images of that. And then we even went so far as to play around with having ChatGPT generate Blender Python code to try to create the shape in a 3D modeling program of the thing that they had designed visually, which didn't work perfectly, but it worked well enough that made us kind of ponder the future of what this could be for design. And even since the class, there's been some new plugins made available in Blender that let you textually describe a shape and have it be generated as a 3D model that you can then use and send for 3D printing or whatever. So yeah, it's a good summary.
I've got slides of those outputs too, if it's appropriate to share those outputs at one point too.
Sure. Or you could, if they're, you probably don't have them online anywhere, but you could drop it in chat. I did have a question though, because we're coming up at the end of the day, and there's two questions I have for you all to answer. And the first one is, going into this, we didn't know, and I would like to know where you, and James talked a little bit about this, and I think Howard started to, where did the tools fall short? Where were you frustrated, or where were students frustrated? And where did it not work out as good as you hoped? And neither one of you can jump in.
I kind of fell in love with some of the faults that it had because they were often like really just these like dumb mistakes, and and when it would do it in front of the class, and I would be able to just sort of emphasize, you really have to check this stuff. You can't just take this for what it is. I think that we're in like this weird honeymoon period where the stuff is just garbage enough that we can still see it all the time, that we look for it, but also that it's starting to create outputs that are convincing enough to be useful. And I guess my heart lies with the garbage. I like to see where it's stumbling because I learned something about it as well, and the way that it's operating. And as an artist, oh gosh, I love this. Well, that's like what I was saying is like with this book in particular, right? Just the ways that these things are like sort of on the page. It looks like there's meaning in there, but I know that there's no meaning. And so I'm going to mess with some future archaeologist that finds this.
Yeah, and by the way, you guys, I wish you could see the book in person. It is magical when you hold it. And it brings up a comment when we posted about this seminar or symposium, sorry, and we used AI generated art. So the person talking to the robot was something I generated out of Midjourney. We generated like 20 images, and the library marketing team picked that one. Somebody wrote back and was just, politely tearing us apart on the quality of the image, because there's definitely flaws. If you dig in, you look at it at once like, oh, that's a person talking to a robot, no problem. But you start looking at it, they have too many earlobes, they're missing a hand, the coat doesn't line up. There's a lot of flaws that a real artist would not tolerate. But I think that's kind of perfect. That's a perfect place. So I ended up falling in love with a little bit with our image of, here's this art that we did, and it's better than Mariah or I could hand draw. And we wanted to use AI to generate it because it's thematic for what we're talking about. And it has all these really subtle flaws for people with expertise in the subject. They saw things that I didn't notice the double earlobe at all. And they zoomed right into it and said, this is a problem. And oh, so by the way, they probably stole somebody else's artwork. And, that's a whole nother conversation we've been having. But yeah, there's definitely warts, and I think you got to see them, work with them, ignore them, or if you're James, you can love them. And,
I can speak to that too, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that when it comes to art, that's absolutely, a wonderful place to appreciate. But when it comes to industrial design, we can't celebrate the warts as much because it's a real more precise endeavor. And so the challenge and the cautionary tale that I would express about our process and the shortcoming is when you generate, and some of the images that we did generate from creating the prompts from ChatGPT and then inputting it into DALL-E or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, when it outputs something and you ask it to render an image that looks like a water bottle that's vacuum stainless steel, and it comes out and it looks like it, but it's just not quite right because the AI doesn't understand it's mashed together in all these images. Well, when it's convincing but it's inaccurate, that's a problem in design, in industrial design, because the problem is that once we see something and we think it's real, then we're convinced of its existence, and that doesn't make it. There's a feedback loop that's problematic. Because once like decision makers see something that looks convincing and real, then there's buy-in, and it's really hard to change minds when something is bought in. So it's a real cautionary tale, I would say, in this exploration that we did, because once students saw something that was rendered, it's hard to convince them otherwise. So I think that or at least in industry, that's kind of one of the challenges is, to convince something to start back from scratch so that you can come up with a better solution if something isn't working out. It's really a challenge in industry. So I think when you have an output that's real looking, that's where the shortcoming is there when it's not precise.
And so it's kind of a dangerous one too, right? It kind of, what you're saying kind of reminds me of the story of the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion that came down to the idea that they knew about the problem, but the problem was basically buried in a very visually appealing PowerPoint slide. So everyone
Right.
just kind of went, nobody struggled with it. Nobody went, they're like, oh, that looks like a really nice slide. It must be okay. And the thing blew up. And so, you know, I think for design and how many buildings have we seen? I walk around town and I look at some of the buildings and architecture and it's like, I bet you that looked really good on a PowerPoint slide, but it doesn't look so good in reality. So yeah, there's I think you've raised a really good concern, is that all of these tools, these AI tools, are designed and trained to give us what we think we want. And that may not be what we need. And that's, I think Roxana would agree, John had to leave, but I think he would agree that they're trying to give us the candy, the thing that we're asking for. And it might be good if we're disciplined about how we ask for it, but it may be bad if we're a little easy to fool. But that's why we have experts like you guys to help keep us on the rails.
I think another issue that's going on here is that these models are just so general that we're going to see models in the future, Kahar, that are like focused more on these actual objects. And I don't want to be all rah-rah, it's going to get better, but I think that certain aspects of this are going to get better as we bring our expertise to it and say, I want this and I want this in it. I wanted to bring up another point, which is just to say that I am completely not in favor of the way that a lot of these artists, these living artists' materials have been sort of pulled into these things, and without like sort of the consent of them are being like reproduced and so forth. I think that for me is like a big challenge, and I think that there is a point there that regulation might be appropriate. But I don't want these 70-year-old white guys in Congress to do it, though. I think that they're just going to mess it up, and I don't want them to copyright style, because then Disney will own all styles.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my rant.
Do you think Greg Rutkowski's career has been improved or worsened by the advent of generative AI? And for everybody in the audience, Greg Rutkowski is this fantasy artist, is really talented. He was used in an example in the early days of Stable Diffusion. So everybody just said Greg Rutkowski's style. And so there was just a flood of artwork that looked like his. And the question is, did that help him or hurt him? And I don't know.
His name has become a synonym for high quality art.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But I can't imagine being in that position and having that sort of that flooding of the internet and not being able to find your own work online with a Google search.
Yeah.
But that's a Google problem, honestly. That's not an image, and we're going to see more of that just because these things can create such huge volumes of images and text.
Yep.
And
all right.
I think that's an interesting, well, I was going to just add to that, because we just had Jordan Taylor from viscom.ai speak to us in industrial design. And so for anybody who hasn't used it, viscom.ai is a sketching AI collaborator tool. And so there's also that aspect of like, you can, they did some experimental training around Scott Robertson, who's a premier industrial design designer. So, you know, I think that that's an interesting, you know, I'm hopeful for the future of training, but it's also problematic again, because your inputs and outputs are, you know, being trained in those styles, as long as the styles are relevant and useful.
Absolutely. All right. Well, in the time we have left, I guess I would like to ask you, you know, do you have plans to use AI going forward as a core part of your curriculum, or do you see it as kind of an edge case, or not? And if so, what do you envision?
Absolutely. My students loved it. It helped break them out of the norms of whatever thought patterns and inspiration they were drawing from before. So it's expanding, I think, the potentials of ideation. So absolutely, I'll be using it as an inspiration tool. That's how I always advocate for using it as inspiration. It doesn't produce usable, you know, output, but it's useful that way.
All right.
I've been teaching technology for 15 years, and I've just sort of seen the way that it moves through the medium, digital media art. Absolutely going to integrate it even perhaps a little bit more. I'm anxious to see how it works with the coding assignments, because what I'm really trying to do is go after the things that are hard for students, that are hard for me, and see if there's like a way to leverage the tools to make it either a little bit more joyful or a little bit simpler. And so like debugging P5.js sketches is tragically difficult. So I do intend to use it. It's interesting that we sort of like dip into it and dip out of it. Like when we were doing Photoshop, working on our Photoshop projects, our mashup projects, we didn't have a lot of use for the AI. But fairly soon, Photoshop's going to have like both plugins and like sort of the generative context for it as well. So we're going to see that stepping into it. Whether it'll be useful is another thing.
Yep, agreed. All right, let's see. So we have some questions from the audience here. Some are in the chat, I think, but also in the question queue. So I guess first off, James, the question is, I'm curious as to how their results compared to just Googling the same thing. I think that's referring to the finding the new media artists. So why not just use Google?
So Google has steadily become harder to use in certain instances. I don't know what the difference is per se, but I found when I started looking for this through ChatGPT that I got better results. So I wanted to make sure that I exposed that to my students. The real challenge with Google is getting something that ends up being relevant oftentimes. And I guess it just doesn't understand the media as well. But that is a good question. That is a good question.
All right. So another question is, and I'm just going to invite Roxana, if you want to unmute on this one, feel free, because it's kind of going to touch on you as well. It seems to me that a lot of the dissenters about ChatGPT come from research / writing heavy disciplines, while the innovative and more useful applications of it to classes are coming from disciplines that involve more multimodal work. Is that accurate? And is there a way to bridge that? Or do you think usage of generative AI will be bifurcated along those lines? What do you guys think? Anybody want to jump? That's a hand grenade of a question, I know.
Can you rephrase that real quick?
So the idea is that some of the writer of the question seems to take the position that the dissenters about ChatGPT come from research / writing heavy disciplines, while the innovative and more useful applications of it, our classes, are coming from disciplines that involve more multimodal work, coding, sculpting, designing, creating novel ideas. Is that accurate? And is there a way to bridge that so that maybe there's a win-win on both sides? Or do you think that the usage of generative AI will bifurcate it? In other words, maybe for Kohar and you for generating artistic ideas and design elements, it's going to be great. But for educational psychology, it's going to be forbidden because it's going to give you garbage data and plagiarism.
So thanks for inviting the response from me. I appreciate it specifically. I think it's an interesting observation of the fields that are paying attention to like the critical perspectives versus those that are like, oh, this is exciting, it's inspiring, etc. And I think it may have to do with our lens and what we're paying attention to. Also, I think that your proximity to people who are harmed by the tech is really important. And so when you see communities where facial recognition, like where the AI is actually doing harm, someone has actually, spent time in jail because they've been misidentified. It hits you a little harder. So I'm a critic of the tech because I know people who've been harmed by it. And so it's harder for me to buy into the hype and the excitement around it because I just don't see it as, I don't see the value of it as being as important as like trying to prevent harms. And so I think it just affects people differently depending on their proximity and also just what they study. I'm looking at, again, children, longitudinal data harms, these hidden ways that the analytics that are being taken, the data heist of whatever the prompts we're even putting in, where are the hidden harms behind it that could end up weaponizing the data rather than, being something that's like interesting and innovative, like for our classes. I think it's just, so I don't know if about the bifurcation of like can we come together? I think these conversations are really important. Hopefully, if there's areas of the concern that you weren't aware of, that maybe these conversations open up, that's a good thing. And then for those of us who are the critics to recognize, gosh, there is a lot of excitement and hype about this that we may not have, factored into our critiques. So I don't know, others want to chime in?
So I would like to say that I was not asked to talk about ethics and the issues associated with it. So I focused on my use in the courses. I have a lot of concerns that are associated with that as well. And particularly those that come out of the stochastic parrots paper in particular. And so I don't, having taught technology for 15 years, there are very few technologies that don't contact some sort of harm somewhere. I mean, like look at our cell phones and the minerals that are in there that are mined by slave labor. This is not to say that that's an excuse. I guess I am excusing myself on some level with it, but I'm saying that my existence is in this space. There's harm that comes out of the things that I use. I think that there's also good that comes out of it. And that's what I'm that's what I was focusing on in terms of the conversation today.
Yeah, and I could expand on that a little bit as well. I think that it's a great point that you're bringing up. Do the ends justify the means? And there's definitely a critique and concern as well for us, even as design educators. But at the same time, I think that what I'm excited about too is that this collaborative, the speed at which there's the positive potential is also for computers to really earn their keep. And that promise of what computers were originally promising is to save time and to speed things up. And so there's this potential there that I'm hopeful for, even though I know that there's there's so much oversight, there's so much dialogue, there's so much concern, there's so much that needs to happen to make this a really positive transition to implement more in how we use it. So I appreciate all of the dialogues that I'm hearing today, because it's expanding all of our awareness around these topics.
Great. Okay, well, what other comments, or do you have any other comments? And let me just open it up to everybody who was a panelist today. Kent, you included. Jill, let's see who's remaining. Anybody who has a final thought, and I'll move into the last phase of the day.
Yeah, I have a thought that I just wanted to share. I cover a lot of ethics on both the Voices of VR and AI, but I also talk to a lot of artists. And so I have traveled and did some really in-depth conversations with artists who are actually actively using ChatGPT and these generative AI systems. And for a lot of folks who are not primarily coders or have had they're neurodivergent in different ways, where they have trouble communicating to other people about what they want. And so they found that communicating through ChatGPT was able to help them do rapid prototyping. But also, like one of the folks I talked with, Violetta Jaguar, she's an indigenous person from South America. And so when she types in, give me images of indigenous people, they're all sort of like these sort of stereotypical images with like feathers. And so as an artist, she doesn't see that she has her own representation, so she has to train her own models. So even though she's in this realm of interactive media, there's still going to be bias that is going to be in these systems, and depending on how they're playing out, they're still going to be there. So it's not just that like it's only dedicated to the folks that are doing language-based stuff or stuff that people who are doing design stuff. Like no matter what, any domain, there's going to be limitations and bias in these models, and you may not have discovered what those are, but they're certainly there. Especially if, just thinking about design aesthetics as an example, there's going to be underrepresented artists and people who are creating stuff who are not represented in those data sets. And so I think it's just recognizing that there's these invisible layers that are going to be amplified, and that a part of this discussion of that ethics is to be, as much as we can, know what is in there or not. And that's part of the problem with models like ChatGPT, is because there's no transparency as to what is or is not in that data. So that sort of amplifies it. So it sort of has this black box occluded nature of it. So because of that, we actually don't know what is or is not in there, so that we can't actually fully articulate some of these more nuanced things as we move forward. So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, and I always like to jump in anytime someone's talking about the lack of transparency in the data set. When you're talking about comparisons between different types of disciplines and which ones are getting more into this than others, for libraries as a discipline, we tend to more respond to what's popular. One of the reasons, one search for SJSU looks the way it does now is because when Google took off, everybody was using Google search and they wanted the library to look like that. So from a library perspective, I want to learn all I can about this on the advent that, 5-10 years from now, everybody's like, I'm not going to use the library database unless it looks like chat, whatever is popular at the time, so some disciplines do have that need for responsiveness to whatever the trends are, but it's important that all the disciplines are looking at it from their perspectives, which is how we get kind of a full and nuanced view of things, looking at it from different angles.
Absolutely. All right. So one more segment and we'll wrap up. All of you, if you want to think about the last 15-second soundbite you want to give, I'll come back to you in just a couple minutes. We're just going to go through, and I want to show everybody a little bit about where we're going. Some new stuff is dropped, and I have some questions for the folks who are remaining. So thank you, everybody who's stuck it out to the end of the day here. So one of the things that GPT-4 announced and has happened is the idea of multimodal GPT. So we've been talking about text, but very soon, in fact, today even, you can get a model that will interpret images, and very soon video and audio. So you will be able to feed it information from multiple sources, not just text prompts. And there's one you can get now called Mini GPT-4, and I put the GitHub link there. It's a very demanding application. You need 24 gigabytes of VRAM, which most people will not have. But there's also a hosted demo that you can try. It's very busy. It takes like 10 to 15 minutes to generate an image. So I did some for you last night. So let's take a look at what it does. So on the left, this is a demo of Mini GPT-4. On the left, I put the logo up for this talk, and I asked it, what's this picture all about? And it understands the image. So the image shows a man in a suit. All right, man, not perfect, but good enough. And Ty standing next to a robot. Robot has humanoid appearance with head, torso, and arms. Fair enough. The man is looking at, I would have preferred if it said person, but fine, is looking at a robot with a curious expression on his face. The background is a plain white color. So it's not really a plain white color, but I still think that's pretty interesting that it's able to pull that from that. And then I asked, what does the image say? And it is able to read the text. It says Clever Tech Talks, AI Tools, Tips, and Traps. And it goes on to describe that. So imagine a world where this is machine efficient and there's things happening. You're going to have AI looking at video feeds, pictures, art, drawings. If you looked at the GPT-4 demo when they launched it, it sketched out a website and had it write the code for it. Very powerful. And I probably could give Roxana and John an hour to tell me all the ways this is bad, because it could be, and believe me, I get it, but it's happening. It's already here. We can do it. So here's one for a little bit of fun. I found this image. This is not my kids, but it was a weird image. I wanted to see what would it do with something that's not like a copy paste clip art thing. And I said, what's going on in this picture? And it says, it appears that the child is sitting on a couch with a large piece of chocolate cake in front of her. So it's guessing the gender of the child, which I guess, I don't know. 2 dogs are sitting next to her. Cool. That's true. One on either side. The child is smiling, a little bit, and appears to be enjoying the cake. It's kind of funny. So I corrected it. I said, that's not cake. It's chocolate sauce on the couch. Is this a funny image? If so, why? And I thought the response was very interesting. It's not cake. It's chocolate sauce on the couch. It's not necessarily a funny image. but it could be considered humorous depending on the context in which it's viewed. And as a parent, I agree. The image could be considered funny because it's unexpected to see a chocolate sauce on the couch, and it may be surprising or amusing to some people. Additionally, the presence of the two dogs could add humor as they seem to be enjoying the chocolate sauce as well, which I thought was a very interesting thing for it to pull out of that. I'm not sure how that comes out of the model, but it's important to note that humor is subjective, and while one person finds funny, another person may not. So just as a point of interest, is kind of mind-blowing that we're here already. You know, a year ago, this would have been science fiction. Nobody would have predicted this, or maybe I wouldn't have predicted it. But now you can do this right now. If you follow the links, there's demo links. You can upload an image and have a chat about what you see in the image. I could see this being very useful, you know, from an art perspective. You know, let's discuss the art. What does the art say? And that could go both ways. Maybe it's not what the artist intended and it's what the model intends. I don't know, but it's interesting, and there's definitely going to be some interesting applications that come out of it. The other thing that's happening, and if you follow the industry at all, there's the idea of intelligent agents using these large language models, particularly GPT-4, to do automated tasks, to link it into services on the internet. And I got some links here, and I don't know if I have time to even show you, but it's kind of a deep discussion. Agent GPT, Auto GPT, you can give it broad goals and will even write code for you in real time to execute searches and build databases and give it some autonomy. A lot of examples on the internet of this working. It's still very early. It's very buggy. It has all the problems we've been discussing. It is potentially dangerous to your system and to your own personal information, so be careful if you play with it, but it is certainly fascinating. And then there's also these platforms such as LangChain, which would be another whole 4-hour conversation, but it's basically a platform that allows you to link in APIs to web services, to these large language models to do various tasks, and it's going strong. So these are open source projects. You can look at the code, you can see how they work, you can build them on your own system. You can use private language models as well as like GPT-4 and Bard and all these other ones. But it is something to keep an eye on, because these things, once people work them out, they're going to be content monsters. Like you have not seen spam like is coming. The wave of spam that will evade our spam filters and our human filters and all that is going to be formidable. So we'll have to solve that problem. So for the audience who's here, the 52 of you who have stuck it out for 3 hours, would there be interest in a monthly working group around specific technologies and projects in AI? I think there's every single day when I get out of bed, I look at my computer, there's a new release of a new interesting model. We didn't even touch on the other area. I mean, it took us this long just to get through like the discussion about large language models, but there's image segmentation, there's audio. I didn't even really ever get to talk about 11 labs and the cloning of voices. Deepfakes, which is an old problem, but refreshed and by times 10 compared to what we could do in the old days. So there's a lot of digital fakery going on that we should talk about, but also some interesting possibilities for applications to preserve culture, to preserve narratives, to extend our functionality and extend our productivity in the things we want to do for ourselves. So there's some things there that we want to discuss. And James and I are, and hopefully some of the other panelists who joined us today are interested in forming a grassroots committee at San Jose State. Working title is AIDEA, which is AI and Digital Ethics Advisory Committee. One of the first orders of business is to figure out if that's the name or not. But the idea is, I think there's a need for us to get together as staff and faculty and maybe some students as well to really wrestle with these ideas, because as you saw today, there's some things we got to think about really hard. And I think we can actually help a lot. There's a tremendous amount of leverage that we have by thinking about these issues now, getting ahead of it as much as we can, and being an advocate for the ethical use of these tools. I don't have any illusions that we can't stop it. I mean, I don't believe that. Maybe we can. Maybe there's things that should be done first, but I think business has declared their intention. So now we need to figure out how to mitigate the risk to our students and to the world, and use what these tools provide us for good as much as possible, and be aware of the risks. So to that end, I want to have us to get together in person or via Zoom, have some working groups, and really think about how we could put some policies in place, whether or not they're official policies or guidelines that we share, some tools and technology, make people aware of what's available. I would definitely love to hear from you. So if you're on the call, my email is here. It's john.oakes, jon.oakes at sjsu.edu. It'll be in the slides. We'll post it in the follow-up emails. So feel free to reach out and we'll arrange something before the end of the semester. All right. So I think that is the last slide, and I have 2 minutes to spare. Yay. So for everybody who participated today, who's still here on the panelist side, and any closing thoughts as we let people go about their day? Just shout them out.
I have some.
Oh, you're muted.
Some. Oh, really? Can you hear me?
Maybe my speaker's died. I don't know. Go ahead. Keep talking.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll leave you with some AI existentialism that I shared with my students. Just because it exists doesn't make it real design. Just because it looks real doesn't make it good design.
That's good. I think you could replace design for text, ideas, all that.
Right.
All right. Anybody else?
I'd say that the European Union is leading with legislation. So take a look at the AI Act and what's happening there. It's still in the trilogue process being developed. And I think a lot of the release of ChatGPT has maybe had them reconsider some things. I posted a link to my slides. There's lots of different footnotes that's covering a broad range of different debates. There's folks that are fully bought into the AI hype. And sometimes even the open letter, a lot of the AI ethicists are critiquing it because it's sort of assuming some of the presuppositions of folks who are kind of buying in a certain view of what this AI is and where it's going. And so it's a complicated space with lots of different perspectives. And so hopefully I help to at least map up some of the different dimensions, but there's a lot of different debates and discussions about this. So I like to listen to the artists and see what the artists are doing, but also listen to the AI ethicists who are trying to warn us, because the United States is way behind in regulation. And so the EU is going to be leading on that front. And so look to see what the AI Act does. And hopefully some of those lessons learned will help bring over into the United States, because at this moment, it's basically the Wild West without any real protections for the most egregious harms for this technology. So that's some of my, I guess, final thoughts I'll leave folks with.
Great.
I'm glad to see calls for regulation and transparency as well. And I think, I guess, as a thought to leave folks with is that consent matters. Consent regarding, use of data. There's, reputational harm that's happening with all of the output that's coming out, and people don't consent to their names being used in these ways. I think it's just, we have to keep these conversations going, looking at, how to protect against so many different layers of the harms. So consent matters. Thanks.
I would agree with that completely, and say that a lot of the issues that we are seeing are around sort of the use of data. I've been teaching disruptive technology for 15 years and seeing as it just sort of rolls through the system and then into society. So I don't want to say this is nothing new. It's something new, but the pattern is very familiar. So I'm not wrapped up in this and sort of afraid at this point. I'm actually kind of hopeful, and I'm looking for the places that we can get utility from these things.
Great. All right. I think that's our time. I appreciate everybody who's sticking around. Thank you for the panelists, keynote speaker, Dean Meth, the library marketing team for helping me keep this all going, and Kent for coming to visit. And please visit Kent's site and support him on Patreon so he can get his glasses fixed. And and I hope to see you all in future talks, and let's carry on the discussion. I'm gonna share the outro so we can all have a good afternoon, and feel free to reach out to us in email if you have any other further questions. And the transcript and recording will be posted very soon. All right. Let's see.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming.